Welcome, weary traveller, to a tale that proves evil does not always announce itself with dark robes and skull masks. Tonight, we follow the twisted path of Dolores Jane Umbridge, the witch who wielded cruelty like a wand and dressed tyranny in pink bows and kitten portraits. As you settle into your quiet sanctuary, let these words carry you through the life of perhaps the most despised figure in wizarding history. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of ambition without conscience, where sweetness masked sadism and authority became the instrument of unspeakable cruelty. In a modest terraced house on Spinner's End, where the industrial smoke of Manchester mixed with the acrid scent of magical brewing gone wrong, the Umbridge family existed in a state of perpetual discontent that would shape one of the most notorious witches in magical history. The house itself seemed to reflect the family's internal divisions, with rooms that felt simultaneously too small for their aspirations and too large for their affections, where silence hung heavy as morning fog and conversations died before they could bloom into understanding. Orford Umbridge returned each evening from the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures with shoulders bowed by more than just the weight of his satchel filled with forms and regulations. His work in magical maintenance was honest but humble, involving the unglamorous tasks of repairing damaged magical infrastructure and ensuring that wizard-made objects didn't malfunction in ways that might expose the magical world to Muggle observation. He mopped floors that had been scorched by experimental spells, fixed windows that had been rattled loose by particularly enthusiastic howlers, and maintained the delicate balance of enchantments that kept the ministry functioning smoothly beneath the surface of its more glamorous departments. His lack of ambition wasn't born from laziness, but from a fundamental contentment with useful work that served the greater magical community. Orford found satisfaction in problems that could be solved with practical application of basic magic, in seeing the immediate results of his labor, in knowing that his efforts kept the wheels of magical government turning even if no one noticed his contribution. He had never desired the spotlight or political advancement, viewing such pursuits as unnecessary complications that took energy away from the essential work of maintaining the world that others took for granted. But this philosophical acceptance of his station became a source of deep shame and frustration for his daughter, who observed his daily routine with growing contempt that she was careful to hide behind dutiful smiles and appropriate expressions of filial respect. Young Dolores watched him leave each morning with his patched work robes and humble lunch packed by her mother, and she burned with embarrassment at the thought that this unremarkable man was responsible for her existence, that his blood ran through her veins and his surname attached itself to her own aspirations like a weight designed to drag her down to his level. Ellen Cracknell Umbridge, who had kept her maiden name in the Muggle world, while taking her husband's in magical society, represented an even greater source of shame for her ambitious daughter. She was a woman of genuine warmth and curiosity, who had fallen in love with the magical world through her courtship with Orford, marveling at spells that could mend broken china and enchantments that could keep food fresh indefinitely. Her wonder at magic never diminished, even after years of living within its embrace, and she approached each new discovery with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that she was witnessing miracles that most of humanity would never experience. Ellen's Muggle heritage brought practical skills to the household that pure-blood families often lacked: knowledge of how to manage finances in the non-magical world, understanding of technology that could supplement magical solutions, and most importantly, a perspective that valued magical ability as a gift rather than a birthright. She had grown up in a world where extraordinary things required extraordinary effort, where miracles were rare and precious, where the ability to heal with a wave of a wand or communicate across vast distances with a simple spell represented powers that deserved reverence rather than casual dismissal. But her appreciation for magic, and her genuine love for her wizard husband couldn't overcome the fundamental divide that her blood status created within her own family. Dolores absorbed the subtle tensions that surrounded discussions of Ellen's background, the careful way that Orford's relatives spoke around certain subjects, the nervous glances when Ellen made observations that revealed her non-magical upbringing. Even at a young age, Dolores understood that her mother's heritage was viewed as a deficit rather than simply a difference, a stain upon the family's reputation that required careful management and strategic concealment. The birth of Dolores' younger brother brought these tensions to a crisis that would ultimately tear the family apart completely. The child, who would be named Edgar, showed no signs of magical ability as he grew from infant to toddler, displaying none of the accidental magic that typically marked wizard children in their earliest years. While Orford and Ellen hoped that his powers might simply manifest later than usual, Dolores watched with growing horror as her brother remained stubbornly normal, failing to levitate toys or change colors when emotional, or demonstrate any of the involuntary magical expressions that should have been natural for someone born into a wizarding family. The diagnosis of Edgar as a squib came when he was 3 years old and had shown no magical response to stimuli that should have triggered instinctive reactions in any witch or wizard. The healer who delivered this news did so with professional compassion, explaining that squibs often found fulfilling lives in the Muggle world and that magical families had been supporting non-magical members for centuries. But for Dolores, who was already struggling with shame about her mother's heritage, the addition of a squib brother felt like a confirmation of her worst fears about her family's inadequacy and social standing. Orford and Ellen initially responded to Edgar's condition with the kind of unconditional love that transcends magical ability or social expectations. They researched squib support networks, investigated educational opportunities that might help their son develop skills valuable in either magical or Muggle society, and planned for a future that would honor his worth as an individual rather than measuring him against wizard standards that he could never meet. Their united response to this challenge might have preserved their marriage if other pressures hadn't been building beneath the surface of their relationship. But Dolores watched these developments with growing resentment that she was careful to conceal beneath expressions of sisterly concern and family solidarity. Each accommodation made for Edgar's limitations felt like another barrier to her own social advancement, another explanation she would need to provide to future associates who might question her family's magical credentials. The combination of a Muggle mother and a squib brother created what she perceived as an insurmountable obstacle to the pure-blood status that she had already decided was essential for achieving her ambitions. The family discussions about Edgar's future became increasingly strained as Dolores matured and began expressing opinions that revealed the depth of her prejudice and social climbing aspirations. She suggested, with what she presented as practical concern for her brother's welfare, that he might be happier living entirely in the Muggle world, where his lack of magical ability wouldn't be a constant reminder of his limitations. She argued that maintaining connections between Edgar and the magical world would only create ongoing difficulties for everyone involved, including Edgar himself, who would benefit from finding his place among people who shared his non-magical nature. These arguments, presented with the false sweetness that would become her trademark, gradually poisoned the family dynamic as Ellen recognized the calculating nature of her daughter's concerns, and Orford struggled to balance his love for both his children with his growing awareness of Dolores' troubling attitudes. The conversations that should have focused on supporting Edgar became battlegrounds where fundamental questions about family loyalty and unconditional love were fought through seemingly practical discussions about educational opportunities and living arrangements. The crisis that finally split the family came when Dolores, then 9 years old, was overheard by a family friend referring to Edgar as the mistake, and suggesting that his presence in their home created unnecessary complications for everyone's future prospects. When confronted about these statements, she initially denied making them, then claimed they had been misunderstood, and finally defended them as honest assessments of a difficult situation that required realistic planning rather than sentimental attachment to unrealistic hopes. Ellen's reaction to her daughter's coldness toward Edgar was swift and decisive, recognizing that Dolores' attitudes represented not childhood confusion but fundamental character flaws that threatened the safety and well-being of her vulnerable son. She understood that allowing Dolores to remain in the household while harboring such resentment toward Edgar would create an environment of psychological abuse that could damage him far more than his lack of magical ability ever would. The family meeting that followed this revelation became the formal dissolution of the Umbridge household, though the emotional separation had been developing for months as Dolores' true nature became increasingly apparent to her parents. Ellen announced her decision to leave the magical world entirely, taking Edgar with her to live among Muggles, where his limitations wouldn't mark him as inferior, and where she could protect him from the prejudice that magical society seemed to encourage even among family members. Orford's response to his wife's ultimatum revealed the impossible choice that many magical people faced when confronted with the rigid hierarchies and blood-based discrimination that pervaded their society. His love for Ellen was genuine, and his affection for Edgar was real, but his entire life existed within magical structures that made accommodation of non-magical family members complicated and socially costly. The practical considerations of maintaining his job, his home, and his place in the magical community created pressures that proved stronger than his personal relationships. Dolores, presented with the choice between following her mother and brother into the Muggle world or remaining with her father in magical society, made her decision with calculating precision that revealed the depth of her ambition and the limits of her familial affection. She chose magic not from love of its beauty or appreciation of its possibilities, but from understanding that it represented power and social status that could lift her above the mediocrity she despised in both her parents. The departure of Ellen and Edgar from Spinner's End was conducted with the formal politeness of strangers rather than the emotion appropriate to family separation, as Dolores had already begun the psychological process of erasing them from her personal history. She watched them pack their belongings with the detached interest of someone observing a transaction that didn't concern her personally, offering help that was polite but perfunctory, and saying farewells that carried no genuine emotion or regret. Ellen's final words to her daughter were a warning disguised as advice, delivered with the desperate hope that Dolores might someday understand the costs of choosing ambition over love, status over substance, magical power over human connection. She spoke of the importance of remembering where you came from and honoring the people who had shaped your character, even when acknowledging them became socially inconvenient or professionally disadvantageous. But Dolores received these words as confirmation of her mother's fundamental lack of understanding about how advancement was achieved in competitive environments, viewing Ellen's emphasis on loyalty and authenticity as the kind of sentimental weakness that had kept her father trapped in menial work and her family mired in social mediocrity. She listened with apparent attention, while mentally dismissing every suggestion that conflicted with her own carefully developed philosophy of success through strategic self-presentation and ruthless elimination of anything that might hinder her progress. The house on Spinner's End felt larger after Ellen and Edgar's departure, but also more focused in its remaining occupants' shared commitment to magical advancement and social improvement. Orford, freed from the daily reminders of his marriage's failure and his son's limitations, threw himself into his work with renewed energy while beginning to view his daughter's ambitions as validation of his own choices rather than implicit criticism of his achievements. Dolores flourished in this new environment where her prejudices were no longer challenged by her mother's inclusive worldview or her brother's inconvenient existence, where her father's gratitude for her loyalty created space for her to express opinions and attitudes that would have scandalized Ellen, but which Orford interpreted as appropriate, magical pride and healthy social awareness. The systematic erasure of Ellen and Edgar from the family narrative began immediately after their departure and would continue throughout Dolores's life, as she perfected the art of selective memory and strategic dishonesty that would later serve her so well in professional settings. She practiced telling stories about her childhood that excluded any mention of her mother's Muggle heritage or her brother's squib status, creating alternative versions of family history that presented her background as pure blood and unproblematic. These early exercises in creative autobiography were rehearsed with her father's tacit cooperation, as Orford found it easier to support Dolores's fictional accounts than to defend choices that had ultimately cost him his marriage and his son. Their shared commitment to rewriting history created a bond between them that was based on mutual self-interest rather than genuine affection, but which served both their needs for belonging and validation within magical society's rigid hierarchies. The financial arrangements that Ellen had insisted upon as part of their separation agreement included provisions for Edgar's education and support that required Orford to maintain connections with the Muggle world, sending money through banks and communication methods that reminded him regularly of the family he had chosen to abandon. Dolores observed these obligations with growing resentment, viewing them as unnecessary drains on resources that could be better used to advance their remaining family's prospects within magical society. As she matured and began preparing for her eventual Hogwarts acceptance, Dolores developed strategies for managing questions about her family background that would later prove invaluable in her professional life. She learned to redirect conversations away from topics that might reveal inconvenient truths, to provide just enough genuine information to satisfy curiosity, while omitting details that might damage her carefully constructed image, and to present her family circumstances in ways that enhanced rather than diminished her social standing. The young witch who would leave Spinner's End for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had already demonstrated the character traits that would define her adult career: the willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for professional advancement, the ability to maintain false presentations over extended periods, and most dangerously, the capacity to convince herself that her own interests were identical with larger moral and social goods. The unhappy house had produced a monster who wore the face of propriety, and who would spend her life proving that the most dangerous evil often comes disguised as righteous authority and conventional respectability. The September morning that 11-year-old Dolores Jane Umbridge boarded the Hogwarts Express marked not just the beginning of her magical education, but the first opportunity to test the carefully constructed identity she had spent 2 years perfecting since her mother and brother's departure from her life. Standing on platform 9 3/4 with her father, she presented herself as the picture of pure blood propriety, her trunk packed with robes that had been purchased new rather than inherited, her wand case polished to gleaming perfection, and her demeanor carefully calibrated to suggest both appropriate excitement and refined restraint. Orford Umbridge watched his daughter prepare for this milestone with mixture of pride and anxiety that he was careful to conceal behind paternal confidence and encouraging words. He had spent considerable portions of his modest salary ensuring that Dolores would arrive at Hogwarts with everything necessary to maintain the social position she aspired to achieve, understanding that her success would validate not only her own ambitions, but also his decision to support her version of their family history over the more complicated truth that included Ellen and Edgar. The train journey provided Dolores with her first extended opportunity to practice the social skills she had been developing, through observation of pure-blood families at ministry social functions and careful study of etiquette guides that detailed the behavioral expectations of magical society's upper echelons. She chose her compartment with strategic care, avoiding groups that seemed too boisterous or common, while seeking companions whose appearances and mannerisms suggested appropriate breeding and family connections. Her fellow first years represented a cross-section of magical Britain's social hierarchy, from children of ancient pure-blood families who carried themselves with the unconscious confidence of inherited privilege to Muggle-born students whose wonder at the magical world was written plainly across their faces in ways that made Dolores curl her lip with barely concealed disdain. She positioned herself carefully within this social landscape, claiming connections to respectable families while allowing others to draw conclusions about her background that she neither confirmed nor denied explicitly. The conversations that filled the compartments during the journey to Hogwarts revealed the complex social dynamics that would define her school experience, as students sorted themselves into preliminary groupings based on family reputation, blood status, and shared assumptions about their place within the magical world's established hierarchies. Dolores listened more than she spoke during these early interactions, filing away information about her classmates' backgrounds and allegiances while presenting herself as someone worthy of inclusion among the more socially advantaged groups. Her first glimpse of Hogwarts Castle rising from the shores of the Great Lake filled her with emotions that went beyond mere aesthetic appreciation or academic excitement to encompass recognition that she had finally reached an environment where her ambitions might find appropriate scope and her carefully constructed identity might gain the validation she had been seeking since childhood. The ancient stones and soaring towers represented not just a school but a pathway to the social position and professional opportunities that had been driving her choices since her family's dissolution. The boat journey across the lake provided additional time for social reconnaissance as first years were grouped together in small craft that encouraged intimate conversation and mutual assessment. Dolores used this opportunity to refine her understanding of her classmates' backgrounds while carefully managing her own self-presentation to suggest pure-blood heritage without making specific claims that might be challenged by those with more direct knowledge of established family lineages. The Great Hall's magnificence exceeded even her carefully managed expectations, with its enchanted ceiling reflecting the night sky and floating candles casting warm light over 4 long tables where older students watched the incoming first years with expressions ranging from welcoming interest to calculating assessment. Dolores took in every detail of the scene while maintaining the composed demeanor she had practiced for years, understanding that this moment would set the tone for all her future relationships within the castle's walls. Professor McGonagall's explanation of the sorting process confirmed what Dolores had already learned. Through her research into Hogwarts traditions and house characteristics, but hearing the details presented officially gave weight to decisions she had been considering throughout her journey from London. She understood that her house placement would influence not only her academic experience but also her social connections and professional opportunities for decades to come, making the Sorting Hat's decision crucial to everything she hoped to achieve. The sorting ceremony proceeded with alphabetical precision that built anticipation as each name was called, and each new student was assigned to their house amid cheering from their new housemates and polite applause from the other tables. Dolores watched each placement with analytical interest, noting patterns in the hat's decisions and observing the reactions of students whose backgrounds she had been able to determine during the train journey and boat ride. When Professor McGonagall finally called Umbridge, Dolores, the 11-year-old witch, walked to the sorting stool with measured steps that conveyed confidence without arrogance, awareness of the moment's significance without nervous energy that might suggest anxiety about the outcome. She had considered the possibility of placement in any of the 4 houses and developed strategies for succeeding within each potential environment, though her personal preferences were clearly aligned with one particular option. The Sorting Hat's weight settling onto her head brought immediate awareness of the magical artifacts penetrating consciousness, probing her thoughts and motivations with thoroughness that made her grateful for years of practice. In controlling her expressions and managing the information she revealed about herself, she felt the hat's attention focusing on aspects of her character that she preferred to keep private while she worked to project the qualities she most wanted, acknowledged, and rewarded. The hat's internal voice, speaking directly into her consciousness, posed questions about her ambitions and values that required careful consideration of how much truth to reveal versus how much strategic presentation might influence the final decision. Dolores found herself engaged in a psychological chess match with an opponent whose experience and insight vastly exceeded her own, but whose ultimate purpose aligned with her own goals of appropriate placement within Hogwarts' social structure. Interesting, the hat's voice murmured within her mind, as it sorted through her memories and motivations with uncomfortable precision. Ambition, certainly, and cunning in abundance. A willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for advancement, and a deep hunger for power and recognition. Yes, I think there can be no doubt where you belong. The pause that followed felt like an eternity before the hat's voice rang out across the great hall. Slytherin! The Slytherin table erupted in applause as Dolores walked toward her new housemates with satisfaction that she was careful to temper with appropriate modesty and grateful acknowledgement of their welcome. She had hoped for this placement throughout her preparation for Hogwarts, understanding that Slytherin House's reputation for producing successful ministry officials and influential pure-blood leaders made it the optimal environment for someone with her social and professional aspirations. Her new head of house, Professor Horace Slughorn, greeted the incoming Slytherin first years with characteristic enthusiasm that masked careful evaluation of each student's potential for bringing credit to his house and useful connections to his extensive professional network. Dolores observed his initial interactions with her new housemates, while mentally cataloguing information that might help her gain his favor and secure advantages that could accelerate her academic and social progress. But Slughorn's reaction to Dolores proved immediately problematic in ways that she struggled to understand or overcome, despite her best efforts to demonstrate the qualities she believed would appeal to someone with his background and interests. During their first formal meeting, she presented herself with carefully practiced charm and subtle hints about family connections that should have sparked his professional curiosity about her potential value to his famous Slug Club of promising students with useful backgrounds. Instead, Slughorn's response was politely distant in ways that suggested immediate dislike, disguised behind professional courtesy and house solidarity. He listened to her carefully prepared introductory remarks with expressions that grew increasingly skeptical, asked questions about her family background that revealed uncomfortable depth of knowledge about ministry personnel and pure-blood genealogies, and concluded their interview with pleasantries that barely concealed his negative assessment of her character and prospects. The reasons for Slughorn's antipathy remained mysterious to Dolores throughout her Hogwarts career, though she gradually came to understand that her head of house possessed insight into personality and character that exceeded his reputation for social climbing and professional networking. He seemed to recognize something in her nature that transcended her carefully constructed presentations, some fundamental quality that repelled him despite her obvious intelligence and apparent dedication to house values. This early rejection by the person whose approval she had most hoped to gain set the tone for much of her Hogwarts experience, as other students and faculty members seemed to absorb Slughorn's assessment and treat her with similar wariness, despite her academic achievements and persistent efforts to demonstrate her worthiness of inclusion and respect. She found herself consistently overlooked for opportunities and positions that should have been available to students with her qualifications and house standing. Her academic performance was exemplary from the beginning, with marks that placed her among the top students in her year across multiple subjects and particular excellence in areas that required memorization of complex rules and regulations rather than creative application of magical principles. She approached her studies with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all her endeavors, viewing excellent grades not as ends in themselves but as tools for advancing her larger social and professional goals. Defense against the dark arts became her favorite subject, not from any particular fascination with the magical theory involved, but from recognition that expertise in this area would be valuable for future ministry, career, advancement, and would provide knowledge that could be used to maintain power and control over others. She absorbed information about dark arts detection and defensive techniques with hunger that went beyond mere academic interest to encompass understanding of how such knowledge could be weaponized for personal advantage. Transfiguration proved more challenging due to its requirement for imaginative thinking and intuitive grasp of magical transformation principles that couldn't be simply memorized from textbooks or absorbed through repetitive practice. Professor McGonagall's teaching methods emphasized creative problem-solving and individual expression that conflicted with Dolores's preference for clearly defined rules and established procedures that could be mastered through diligent application rather than innate talent. Potions class under Professor Slughorn's instruction became a source of ongoing frustration as her head of house's personal dislike colored his evaluation of her work despite her technical competence and careful attention to precise measurement and timing requirements. She brewed potions that met all objective criteria for success while receiving marks and feedback that suggested mediocrity, gradually realizing that Slughorn's assessment reflected his judgment of her character rather than her actual performance. Her relationships with fellow Slytherin students developed along lines that reflected the complex social hierarchies within the house and the larger dynamics of pure-blood society that many of her housemates had absorbed from birth. Students from established families like the Malfoys and Lestranges carried themselves with confidence born from generations of privilege and social position, while those from newer wealth or more modest backgrounds worked to prove their worthiness of inclusion among magical society's elite circles. Dolores positioned herself within this hierarchy through careful cultivation of useful relationships while maintaining appropriate distance from students whose backgrounds might reflect poorly on her own social standing. She sought friendships with those whose family connections could advance her goals, while avoiding associations that might raise questions about her pure blood credentials or suggest inappropriate tolerance for blood status mixing. Her dormitory roommates provided daily opportunities for social interaction and mutual assessment that shaped much of her Hogwarts experience, as the intimate environment of shared living quarters made concealment of personality traits and background details virtually impossible over extended periods. Dolores worked constantly to maintain her carefully constructed persona while gathering intelligence about her roommates' weaknesses and advantages that might be useful for future manipulation or advancement. The other Slytherin girls gradually came to view Dolores with mixture of respect for her academic achievements and wariness about her calculating approach to personal relationships, recognizing that she treated friendships as strategic alliances rather than genuine emotional connections. They observed her tendency to collect useful information about their families and backgrounds while revealing little authentic detail about her own circumstances, creating atmosphere of mutual suspicion that prevented development of genuine intimacy or trust. Severus Snape, despite being a fellow Slytherin and someone whose background should have made him sympathetic to her social climbing aspirations, proved particularly resistant to her attempts at friendship and alliance building. His immediate dislike of her seemed to stem from recognition of character flaws that resonated with his own experiences of prejudice and social manipulation, making him unusually perceptive about her true motivations and resistant to her false charm. Their interactions during shared classes and house activities were marked by barely concealed mutual antipathy that both worked to disguise behind house loyalty and appropriate courtesy, but which was obvious to observers who understood the subtle dynamics of Slytherin social politics. Snape's rejection of her overtures particularly stung, because his academic brilliance and obvious intelligence made his approval valuable, while his dismissals suggested character defects that she preferred not to acknowledge. The prefect selection process during her 5th year became a source of intense disappointment and resentment that would influence her attitudes toward authority and recognition for the rest of her life. Despite her excellent academic record and apparent dedication to house values, she was passed over for the position in favor of students whose qualifications she considered inferior, but whose personalities were apparently more appealing to the faculty members responsible for making such decisions. Her failure to achieve prefect status felt like public confirmation of the social rejection she had been experiencing throughout her Hogwarts career, validation of suspicions that her carefully constructed identity wasn't successfully concealing whatever qualities made her fundamentally unacceptable to those whose approval she most desperately sought. The disappointment was made worse by her certainty that family connections and pure blood status were being valued above merit and dedication. The headgirl appointment during her 7th year represented another opportunity for the recognition and authority she craved, but once again she found herself overlooked in favor of a student whose background and personality were deemed more suitable for representing Hogwarts to the larger magical community. The pattern of rejection, despite academic excellence and apparent qualification, created deep wells of resentment that would later fuel her authoritarian approach to educational administration and her punitive attitude towards students who challenged established authority. Her attempts to understand the reasons for these consistent rejections led to extensive self-examination and strategic adjustment of her behavioral presentations. But the fundamental character traits that made her unsuitable for leadership positions were too deeply embedded in her personality to be modified through conscious effort. The calculating nature that made her academically successful also made her emotionally remote and manipulative in ways that faculty members recognized, even when they couldn't articulate specific objections to her candidacy. The social dynamics of Slytherin House during the 1960s reflected broader tensions within magical society, as traditional pure-blood families struggled to maintain their influence in face of changing political attitudes and increasing acceptance of Muggle-born magical practitioners. Students from families with dark arts connections began expressing views that would later align with Voldemort's ideology, while others sought to distance themselves from such extremism while maintaining their social positions. Dolores navigated these political undercurrents with characteristic calculation, avoiding explicit endorsement of any particular faction while positioning herself to benefit from whichever side eventually proved victorious. Her statements on blood purity and magical superiority were carefully calibrated to appeal to traditionalist sentiment without crossing lines that might create legal liability or social stigma among more moderate elements within the wizarding establishment. Her graduation from Hogwarts in 1963 represented achievement of her immediate academic goals, while highlighting the social failures that would drive much of her subsequent behavior and career choices. She left the castle with excellent marks and comprehensive magical education, but without the personal relationships or character references that typically facilitated successful transition into professional life and adult wizarding society. The 7 years she had spent at Hogwarts had refined her manipulative skills and deepened her understanding of magical society's power structures, but it also revealed fundamental personality defects that made genuine human connection virtually impossible and authentic leadership permanently beyond her reach. The patterns of rejection and isolation that had defined her school experience would continue throughout her adult life, creating, accumulating resentment that would eventually find expression through the systematic abuse of whatever authority she managed to acquire. The young witch who departed Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry carried with her not just magical knowledge and academic credentials, but also deep psychological wounds that would fester throughout her career, driving her to seek through institutional power and bureaucratic authority the recognition and respect that personal character and genuine achievement had failed to provide. Her transformation from ambitious student to tyrannical administrator had begun during those formative years, when she learned that excellence without humanity was insufficient for earning what she most desperately craved, while developing the false persona and manipulative techniques that would eventually make her one of the most feared and despised figures in magical government. The Ministry of Magic in 1963 hummed with the constant energy of magical bureaucracy, conducted on a scale that dwarfed most wizards' understanding. Its corridors filled with the sound of interdepartmental memos fluttering overhead like mechanical birds, and the steady rhythm of magical typewriters recording the endless documentation that kept the wizarding world functioning beneath the surface of Muggle society. Into this vast governmental machine stepped 17-year-old Dolores Umbridge, fresh from Hogwarts with exemplary marks and burning ambition that she disguised behind expressions of humble gratitude for any opportunity to serve the magical community through dedicated civil service. Her application for employment had been submitted before her graduation ceremony, accompanied by letters of recommendation that focused on her academic achievements and apparent dedication to proper magical values, while carefully avoiding any commentary on her character or suitability for positions requiring interpersonal skills or ethical judgment. The glowing assessments of her scholarly performance provided sufficient grounds for offering her an entry-level position. Despite the notable absence of personal endorsements from faculty members who had observed her behavior over the summoned 7 years of close interaction, the improper use of Magic Office occupied a cramped corner of Level 2, where the walls were lined with filing cabinets containing reports of magical mishaps, accidental spellcasting, and violations of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy that required investigation and appropriate response. The work was tedious and detail-oriented, involving careful review of incident reports, correspondence with witnesses and violators, and preparation of recommendations for enforcement action or educational intervention depending on the severity and circumstances of each case. Dolores approached her new responsibilities with methodical thoroughness that impressed her supervisors while concealing the calculating assessment she was making of every aspect of the office's operations, personnel dynamics, and opportunities for advancement. She arrived each morning precisely on time, stayed late to complete additional work that hadn't been assigned, and volunteered for tasks that others considered beneath their dignity or too complicated to attempt without extensive guidance and supervision. Her desk was arranged with military precision that reflected not just personal preference for order, but strategic understanding that visual presentation could influence colleagues and superiors' assessment of her competence and dedication. Every document was filed according to systems that improved upon existing organizational methods. Every report was written with attention to grammatical precision and logical structure that made her work stand out among the more casual efforts of her colleagues. But beneath this facade of exemplary service lay careful observation and analysis of office politics that would soon bear fruit in ways that her unsuspecting co-workers couldn't anticipate or prevent. Dolores studied the relationships between different staff members with the intensity of a military intelligence analyst, identifying alliances and rivalries that could be exploited, weaknesses that could be leveraged, and opportunities for advancement that could be pursued through strategic manipulation rather than simple merit or seniority. The other junior employees in the office represented mixture of recent Hogwarts graduates seeking steady employment and older wizards who had found comfortable niches in routine work that didn't demand exceptional talent or ambition. Dolores cultivated relationships with both groups according to carefully calculated assessments of their usefulness for her advancement goals, presenting herself as helpful colleague to those whose friendship might provide advantages, while maintaining professional distance from those whose association might reflect poorly on her own prospects. Her supervisor, a middle-aged witch named Mafalda Hopkirk, who would later become infamous for her correspondence with Harry Potter regarding underage magic violations, initially welcomed Dolores's apparent enthusiasm and competence as relief from the usual challenges of training new employees, who often proved unreliable or unsuited for the meticulous work that proper magic regulation required. Hopkirk's positive assessment of her new subordinate was based on observable performance metrics rather than deeper understanding of character and motivation. Within 6 months of beginning her employment, Dolores had established herself as the most reliable and productive member of the junior staff, taking on increasingly complex cases and producing work that exceeded expectations for someone with her limited experience. Her reports were comprehensive and well-reasoned. Her communication with violators was appropriately firm while remaining professional, and her recommendations for enforcement action demonstrated understanding of both legal requirements and practical considerations. But this exemplary performance was merely the foundation for more ambitious plans that began to unfold as she gained deeper understanding of how the office operated and where opportunities for advancement might be created rather than simply awaited. She began identifying inefficiencies in existing procedures and developing solutions that would demonstrate her value to senior management while positioning her as indispensable for implementing improvements that could benefit the entire department. Her first major opportunity came when a complex case involving multiple violations of the Statute of Secrecy required coordination between different ministry departments and careful navigation of jurisdictional boundaries that had confounded previous attempts at resolution. The case had been assigned to a senior investigator, whose approach was proving inadequate for the political and procedural complications involved, creating potential embarrassment for the office if the matter wasn't resolved successfully. Dolores volunteered to assist with research and documentation for the case, presenting her offer as humble eagerness to learn from experienced colleagues, while concealing her analysis that the senior investigator's methods were fundamentally flawed and that she had identified approaches that would achieve better results. Her initial contributions were so valuable that she gradually assumed increasing responsibility for the case's management, while allowing her supervisor to maintain official credit for its eventual successful resolution. The techniques she employed to gain control of this assignment would become her signature approach to advancement throughout her ministry career, appearing to support and assist superiors while actually identifying their weaknesses and positioning herself as indispensable for achieving their goals. then gradually assuming their responsibilities while maintaining facades of loyalty and subordination that prevented recognition of her manipulative methods until it was too late for effective resistance. Her success with the complex case brought her to the attention of department heads who were impressed by what appeared to be exceptional competence and dedication from such a junior employee, leading to additional assignments that provided further opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities while building relationships with senior officials whose support could accelerate her advancement through the ministry hierarchy. But perhaps more importantly, her handling of the case revealed to observant colleagues the calculating nature that lay beneath her helpful demeanor, as they noticed how quickly she had moved to assume credit and authority while allowing others to bear responsibility for any negative consequences. The pattern of behavior that would later make her notorious was already emerging, though most of her co-workers were too focused on their own responsibilities to analyze its implications or warn potential future victims. The promotion that elevated her from intern to permanent staff member came after 18 months of exemplary service that had established her reputation as one of the most promising young employees in the department's recent memory. The advancement was accompanied by salary increase and additional responsibilities that reflected her demonstrated competence, while providing platform for further advancement towards supervisory positions that would give her authority over other people's careers and professional development. Her new role involved oversight of junior employees and coordination with other departments on cases that required interdisciplinary cooperation, responsibilities that gave her first taste of the power that would later become her primary addiction and the driving force behind increasingly problematic behavior. She discovered that she possessed natural talent for administrative control and bureaucratic manipulation that exceeded her already considerable skills in academic achievement and strategic planning. The junior employees who came under her supervision quickly learned that their new overseer demanded standards of performance and behavior that exceeded anything they had previously experienced, while providing support and guidance that was technically excellent, but emotionally cold, in ways that made their work environment increasingly uncomfortable and stressful. Dolores' approach to management reflected her fundamental inability to form genuine human connections combined with her compulsive need to maintain control over every aspect of situations that fell within her authority. Her relationship with Mafalda Hopkirk evolved from initial mutual respect to subtle tension, as Dolores' growing influence within the office began to challenge established hierarchies and create political complications that threatened existing power structures. Hopkirk recognized that her former subordinate was positioning herself for advancement that might eventually supersede her own authority, but found it difficult to challenge someone whose work remained technically excellent and whose behavior stayed within acceptable bounds of office politics. The strategic alliances that Dolores built with senior officials in other departments provided her with sources of information and influence that extended far beyond her official position within the improper use of magic office, creating networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal favor that would serve her throughout her ministry career. She understood instinctively that advancement in large bureaucratic organizations required cultivation of relationships that transcended immediate supervisory structures and departmental boundaries. Her participation in interdepartmental working groups and policy development committees gave her exposure to high-level decision-making processes while providing platforms for demonstrating her analytical capabilities and strategic thinking to officials who might later be positioned to advance her career. These assignments were often tedious and time-consuming, but Dolores approached them with enthusiasm that reflected her understanding of their long-term value rather than their immediate rewards. The first signs of the sadistic tendencies that would later become notorious emerged during her interactions with wizards and witches who had been accused of magical violations and required investigation or disciplinary action. While her official communications remained appropriately professional, colleagues began noticing that she seemed to derive unusual satisfaction from cases involving harsh penalties or personal consequences for the accused parties, particularly when those individuals came from backgrounds she considered inferior or inappropriate. Her attitude toward Muggle-born wizards who had committed violations was notably harsher than her approach to similar cases involving pure-blood offenders, though she was careful to disguise this prejudice behind explanations based on policy considerations and precedent analysis that provided legally defensible justifications for differential treatment. The discrimination was subtle enough to avoid official censure, while being obvious enough to establish her reputation among certain ministry factions as someone who shared their traditional values regarding blood status and magical hierarchy. By her third year in the ministry, Dolores had established herself as one of the most competent and ambitious young officials in the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, having engineered a transfer that positioned her for more rapid advancement while expanding her authority over a broader range of magical law enforcement issues. The move required careful political maneuvering and strategic presentation of her qualifications, but resulted in promotion to supervisory level, at an age when most of her contemporaries were still struggling with basic job responsibilities. Her new position involved oversight of regulations governing magical creature welfare and human-creature interactions, areas where her personal prejudices aligned perfectly with institutional biases that had existed within the ministry for centuries. The department's traditional approach to non-human magical beings reflected broader wizarding attitudes that viewed such creatures as inherently inferior and potentially dangerous, requiring strict regulation and constant surveillance to prevent threats to magical society. Dolores embraced these responsibilities with enthusiasm that reflected not just professional ambition, but genuine ideological commitment to maintaining wizarding supremacy over all other forms of magical life. Her proposals for strengthening existing regulations and expanding enforcement authority were presented as necessary updates to outdated policies, but actually represented systematic efforts to codify discrimination and institutionalize oppression through legal mechanisms that would be difficult for future administrations to overturn. The work brought her into contact with centaurs, goblins, house elves, and other non-human magical beings whose circumstances provided early targets for the controlling behavior and prejudiced attitudes that would later be directed toward human victims. Her interactions with these creatures revealed the depth of her capacity for cruelty when dealing with beings she considered fundamentally inferior and undeserving of the protections that might be extended to magical humans. Her reports on magical creature policy issues demonstrated comprehensive understanding of legal precedent and regulatory framework, combined with recommendations that consistently favored restriction of creature rights and expansion of ministry authority over non-human magical communities. The thoroughness and apparent objectivity of her analysis concealed ideological motivations that were actually driving her policy positions, making her recommendations seem reasonable and measured rather than prejudiced and oppressive. The promotion that made her head of the office before her 30th birthday represented unprecedented advancement for someone of her age and experience, but was justified by her documented achievements and the support she had cultivated among senior officials, who viewed her as exemplar of dedicated public service and sound judgment. The appointment was celebrated by colleagues who interpreted her success as validation of merit-based advancement within the ministry system. But the speed of her rise through the departmental hierarchy was actually the result of careful manipulation of institutional weaknesses and strategic exploitation of political opportunities that less calculating individuals had failed to. recognize or pursue effectively. Her success reflected not just competence and dedication, but willingness to sacrifice personal relationships and ethical considerations for professional advantage, characteristics that were beginning to create problems even as they facilitated her advancement. The authority that came with her new position included supervision of larger staff, control over significant budget allocations, and influence over policy decisions that affected thousands of magical creatures and the wizards who interacted with them. Dolores approached these responsibilities with systematic thoroughness that impressed superiors while revealing to subordinates the obsessive need for control that would later make her one of the most feared administrators in ministry. History. Her management style during this period established patterns that would characterize all her future positions of authority. Absolute insistence on compliance with her directives regardless of their reasonableness or necessity. Zero tolerance for questioning or criticism from subordinates. And swift retaliation against anyone who challenged her decisions or authority in any way. The office environment under her leadership became increasingly oppressive as employees learned to anticipate her reactions and modify their behavior to avoid triggering her displeasure. The efficiency improvements that she implemented were genuinely beneficial for departmental operations and were cited by senior officials as evidence of her exceptional administrative capabilities, but came at human costs that were not reflected in official performance metrics or budget analyses. Employee turnover increased significantly during her tenure, with many experienced staff members requesting transfers to other departments or leaving ministry service entirely rather than continuing to work under her supervision. The position also brought her into regular contact with senior officials in other departments, relationships that she cultivated with strategic precision while maintaining the facade of dedicated public service and institutional loyalty that had served her so well throughout her advancement. These connections provided access to information about ministry politics and policy debates that allowed her to position herself advantageously for future opportunities, while building coalitions of support that transcended departmental boundaries. Her involvement in interdepartmental initiatives and policy development projects gave her influence over decisions that extended far beyond her official responsibilities. As senior colleagues learned to value her analytical capabilities and relied increasingly on her assessments and recommendations for guidance on complex issues. The trust she gained through consistent delivery of high-quality work created opportunities for expanding her informal authority while maintaining official compliance with hierarchical structures and bureaucratic procedures. But the most significant development during this period was her growing understanding of how institutional power could be leveraged to achieve personal goals that went far beyond simple career advancement or professional recognition. She began to perceive the ministry not just as employer or pathway to social position, but as instrument that could be used to impose her values and preferences on broader magical society through regulatory authority and enforcement power that extended into every aspect of wizarding life. The realization that bureaucratic position could provide platform for social engineering and ideological implementation would later drive much of her most problematic behavior as she learned to use official authority to advance personal agendas while maintaining facades of public service and institutional loyalty that made criticism or resistance seem like disloyalty to magical government itself rather than legitimate opposition to individual abuse of power. Her father's declining health during this period provided opportunity to address what she had always considered the embarrassing circumstances of his employment and social position within magical society, as she used her growing influence to arrange his early retirement with financial benefits that allowed him to withdraw from public visibility while maintaining comfortable lifestyle that ensured his continued cooperation with her preferred, version of their family history. The arrangements she made for Orford's retirement were presented as filial devotion and appropriate care for aging parent, but actually represented strategic elimination of potential source of embarrassment that could have complicated her continued advancement within ministry hierarchy. Her father's gratitude for these provisions ensured his silence about inconvenient aspects of their family background, while removing him from positions where colleagues might encounter him and draw unfavorable conclusions about her origins. The questions that occasionally arose about her relationship to the Orford Umbridge, who had worked in magical maintenance, were deflected through carefully crafted responses that neither confirmed nor denied the connection, while suggesting that such inquiries were inappropriate and potentially offensive to someone of her professional standing and family background. Her ability to discourage such questions without providing direct answers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and social pressure that would later prove invaluable for maintaining her carefully constructed identity. The mysterious accidents and professional setbacks that befell individuals who persisted in asking uncomfortable questions about her background established pattern of intimidation and retaliation that would become her signature approach to managing threats to her reputation and authority. While no direct connection could be proven between these incidents and her displeasure, the correlation was obvious enough to discourage future inquiries, while demonstrating the consequences of challenging someone with her resources and connections. Her attempts to find suitable husband during this period reflected strategic approach to personal relationships that mirrored her professional advancement methods, as she sought marriage that would enhance her social position and provide additional security for her career prospects, rather than emotional fulfillment or genuine companionship. The men she pursued were chosen for their potential utility rather than personal compatibility, leading to series of failed courtships that revealed her fundamental inability to form authentic human connections. The rejection she experienced in romantic contexts proved particularly frustrating because her professional success had led her to expect that her accomplishments and social position would make her attractive to ambitious wizards seeking advantageous marriages. The discovery that personal relationships required qualities she didn't possess and couldn't effectively simulate created additional sources of resentment that would later fuel her hostility toward others whose personal lives seemed more fulfilling than her own. Her growing reputation for competence and dedication was accompanied by increasing recognition among perceptive colleagues that her success came at costs that extended beyond the normal sacrifices required for career advancement, as they observed her isolation from genuine friendship and her apparent inability to find satisfaction in achievements that should have provided personal fulfillment as well as professional advancement. The price she was paying for her ambitions was becoming visible to those who understood the difference between success and happiness. But Dolores herself seemed oblivious to these costs, or perhaps had made conscious decision that power and position were worth any personal sacrifice required to achieve them. Her focus remained fixed on continued advancement through ministry hierarchy toward positions that would provide the authority and recognition she craved, while the human connections and emotional fulfillment that made such achievements meaningful remained permanently beyond her reach through choices she had made and continued to make daily. The foundation was laid during these crucial years for everything that would later make her notorious, as patterns of manipulation, discrimination, and abuse of authority became established aspects of her professional identity, while her capacity for genuine human empathy and ethical behavior atrophied through disuse and deliberate suppression. The promising young ministry employee was evolving into the bureaucratic monster that would later terrorize students, colleagues, and anyone unfortunate enough to fall within her sphere of influence. The summer of 1995 hung heavy over magical Britain like a suffocating blanket woven from denial, fear, and willful ignorance that threatened to smother the truth beneath layers of bureaucratic convenience and political expedience. In the corridors of the Ministry of Magic, where whispered conversations died abruptly when certain names were mentioned and official memoranda carefully avoided acknowledging realities that might disturb the comfortable fiction of peacetime security, Dolores Umbridge moved with predatory grace through opportunities that lesser administrators would never have recognized or possessed the ruthless calculation to exploit effectively. The return of He Who Must Not Be Named, witnessed by Harry Potter and confirmed by Albus Dumbledore, had created a crisis that struck at the very foundations of magical government's credibility and competence, threatening to expose years of complacent assumption and inadequate preparation that had left wizarding society vulnerable to threats that official policy insisted no longer existed. But where others saw catastrophe, Dolores perceived opportunity on a scale that exceeded anything her previous career had offered for advancement and the acquisition of power that could reshape magical society according to her own prejudices and authoritarian instincts. Minister Cornelius Fudge, whose political survival depended on maintaining public confidence in his administration's competence and magical Britain's security, found himself trapped between acknowledgement of inconvenient truths that would destroy his career and denial of evidence that might preserve his position while sacrificing the very people he had sworn to protect. His response to this impossible choice revealed character weaknesses that Dolores had been observing and cataloguing since her elevation to senior administrative positions, understanding that desperate leaders often made decisions that created opportunities for subordinates willing to provide solutions regardless of their moral implications. The psychological profile she had developed of Fudge during months of careful observation revealed a man whose confidence masked deep insecurities about his competence and legitimacy, whose political instincts were sharp enough to identify threats, but whose moral courage was insufficient for confronting challenges that required personal sacrifice or acknowledgement of past mistakes. His fear of appearing weak or incompetent made him vulnerable to manipulation by subordinates who could present themselves as loyal allies while actually advancing their own agendas through his authority and resources. Dolores approached the crisis with characteristic methodical precision, analyzing every aspect of the political situation to identify points where strategic intervention might advance her personal goals, while appearing to serve the minister's interests and the broader stability of magical government. Her assessment revealed multiple opportunities for expanding her influence through exploitation of Fudge's psychological vulnerabilities and the institutional chaos that would inevitably result from the conflict between official, denial, and uncomfortable reality. The first phase of her strategy involved positioning herself as Fudge's most trusted advisor and reliable source of support during the political storm that Potter's claims and Dumbledore's endorsement had unleashed throughout magical society. She presented herself as someone who understood the challenges he faced while possessing the analytical capabilities and bureaucratic expertise necessary for developing effective responses to critics and skeptics whose attacks threatened to undermine his administration's credibility and authority. Her analysis of the situation emphasized the danger that Potter and Dumbledore represented not just to Fudge's political survival, but to the entire structure of magical government, arguing that their claims about Voldemort's return were part of coordinated effort to destabilize legitimate authority and create conditions for Dumbledore's assumption of power through popular acclaim rather than proper electoral processes. This interpretation appealed to Fudge's existing suspicions while providing framework for treating opposition as sedition, rather than legitimate disagreement. The memoranda she prepared for Fudge's consideration were masterpieces of bureaucratic persuasion that combined accurate assessment of political realities with strategic recommendations designed to advance her own position while appearing to serve his interests exclusively. Her proposals for managing the crisis included expansion of administrative authority, enhancement of internal security measures, and systematic efforts to discredit sources of opposition through official channels that would make resistance seem unpatriotic and disloyal. But perhaps her most brilliant innovation was the psychological manipulation she employed to convince Fudge that her advancement was essential for his own survival, presenting her promotion to senior undersecretary as necessary demonstration of his confidence in subordinates who shared his vision and possessed the competence required for implementing policies that would restore public confidence. Magical government. The appointment was structured to appear as reward for loyal service rather than consolidation of power that would make her indispensable for his continued political viability. The position of senior undersecretary carried authority that extended far beyond its official description, providing access to confidential information, influence over policy development, and informal power over other ministry departments that made its holder one of the most influential figures in magical government, regardless of electoral outcomes or ministerial changes. Dolores understood that this appointment represented the culmination of decades of strategic planning and careful advancement, positioning her to implement her long-held beliefs about proper magical society, regardless of opposition from traditional sources of authority. Her first major initiative in this new role was the systematic campaign to discredit Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore through media manipulation and bureaucratic harassment that would demonstrate the consequences of challenging official authority while establishing precedents for more extensive control over public discourse and individual behavior. The strategy required coordination between multiple ministry departments and careful management of public perception through controlled information releases and strategic character assassination. The Daily Prophet, whose independence had been compromised through ministry pressure and financial incentives, became the primary vehicle for spreading official versions of events that contradicted Potter's testimony and Dumbledore's assessment, while presenting Fudge's administration as competent and trustworthy guardians of magical security. The newspaper's transformation from independent journalism to government propaganda demonstrated Dolores's understanding of how institutional capture could be achieved through combination of economic pressure and ideological alignment. But the media campaign was only the foundation for more direct action against those whose opposition threatened official policy and personal advancement opportunities. The decision to deploy Dementors against Harry Potter represented escalation that moved beyond simple character assassination to actual physical assault disguised as law enforcement action, demonstrating willingness to use any means necessary to achieve political goals regardless of legal constraints or moral considerations. The plan to force Potter into using magic in front of Muggles was brilliant in its simplicity and ruthless in its implementation, exploiting legal technicalities and jurisdictional complications to create a situation where his natural defensive instincts would trigger automatic prosecution under laws designed to protect magical secrecy. The psychological sophistication of the trap revealed Dolores's deep understanding of human behavior and legal systems, combining both to create scenarios where victims would effectively prosecute themselves through actions that any reasonable person would consider justified self-defense. The deployment of Dementors to Little Whinging required extensive planning and careful coordination that extended far beyond simple administrative authorization, involving manipulation of creature control protocols and exploitation of bureaucratic procedures that allowed unauthorized use of ministry resources for personal vendettas, disguised as official policy enforcement. The operation demonstrated capabilities for independent action that exceeded anything normally available to ministry administrators, suggesting networks of support and resources that transcended official hierarchies. Fudge's complete ignorance of the Dementor attack confirmed Dolores' assessment of his psychological profile and administrative competence, revealing that he could be manipulated into supporting policies whose specific implementation exceeded anything he would have authorized if presented with complete information about methods and consequences. His plausible deniability was preserved through compartmentalization of information that allowed him to maintain official ignorance while benefiting from results that advanced his political interests. The hearing that resulted from Potter's magical response to the Dementor attack provided perfect opportunity to demonstrate the power that strategic bureaucratic positioning could provide for pursuing personal vendettas through official channels that gave private hatred the appearance of institutional authority and legal legitimacy. The formal proceedings were carefully structured to ensure conviction regardless of evidence or legal precedent, representing triumph of predetermined outcomes over justice or due process. The courtroom atmosphere during Potter's trial reflected broader transformation of magical government from institution dedicated to serving magical society into instrument for advancing particular political factions' interests and individual administrators' personal agendas. The intimidation tactics employed against a teenage defendant demonstrated willingness to use official authority for purposes that bore no relationship to legitimate governmental functions or public service responsibilities. Dumbledore's intervention on Potter's behalf exposed critical weaknesses in the strategy while revealing the limits of bureaucratic power when confronted by individuals whose moral authority and institutional knowledge exceeded anything that official position could provide. His dismantling of the prosecution's case demonstrated that legal expertise and ethical commitment could still overcome administrative corruption when deployed by someone with sufficient courage and competence to challenge established authority effectively. But the hearing's ultimate outcome, while representing tactical defeat for the specific charges against Potter, provided strategic advantages that more than compensated for immediate setbacks in the campaign to discredit opposition voices and establish precedents for expanded government control over individual behavior. The public nature of the proceedings had demonstrated ministry willingness to prosecute popular figures, while the eventual dismissal of charges could be presented as evidence of fair judicial processes that protected innocent citizens from government overreach. The appointment as High Inquisitor at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry represented the perfect synthesis of personal vendetta and institutional authority, providing opportunity to address decades-old resentments about educational experiences while advancing broader political goals through systematic control over magical education and youth indoctrination. The position carried powers that exceeded anything previously granted to ministry representatives within Hogwarts, creating unprecedented potential for reshaping magical society through influence over its future leaders. The legal framework that established the High Inquisitor position was crafted with characteristic attention to bureaucratic detail and jurisdictional authority, ensuring that challenges to her decisions would require lengthy appeals processes through ministry channels while providing broad discretionary powers that could be interpreted to justify almost any action taken in service of educational improvement or institutional security. The ambiguous language of her authorization created opportunities for expansion of authority that would be difficult to challenge through existing legal mechanisms. Her simultaneous appointment as defense against the dark arts professor provided additional platform for implementing educational policies that reflected her beliefs about appropriate magical instruction and social hierarchy, while positioning her to influence student attitudes and behavior through daily classroom interaction that could supplement the broader institutional changes she planned to implement through administrative authority. The combination of teaching and administrative responsibilities created unprecedented concentration of power within single individual. The resistance she anticipated from Hogwarts faculty and student body was not obstacle but opportunity to demonstrate consequences of challenging legitimate authority while establishing her dominance through systematic application of disciplinary measures that would serve as examples for anyone considering future opposition to her policies or directives. The educational environment provided perfect laboratory for testing techniques of social control that could later be applied more broadly throughout magical society. The pink aesthetic that became her signature during this period represented sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare and visual communication, using traditionally feminine colors and decorative elements to disarm opposition, while concealing authoritarian intentions behind appearances of harmless bureaucratic decoration. The cognitive dissonance between her appearance and her actions created confusion among opponents while providing plausible deniability for supporters who could dismiss criticism as overreaction to reasonable administrative policies. The kitten imagery that proliferated throughout her office and personal accessories served similar psychological functions, exploiting cultural associations between cats and feminine domesticity, while concealing predatory instincts behind symbols of harmless pets that posed no threat to established order or individual security. The irony of using symbols associated with independence and hunting to represent submission to authority demonstrated either unconscious self-revelation or deliberate mockery of those too naive to recognize true nature of power. Relationships. Her early interactions with Hogwarts staff revealed both the scope of resistance she would face and the weaknesses she could exploit to overcome opposition from individuals whose authority had been taken for granted for decades, but whose actual power to resist ministry intervention was limited by institutional structures and professional obligations that constrained their options for effective resistance. The faculty's discomfort with her presence was obvious, but their ability to act on that discomfort was severely restricted by employment considerations and legal constraints. Professor McGonagall's immediate hostility provided both challenge and opportunity, representing most formidable opposition she would face, while also offering chance to demonstrate that even respected faculty members were subject to ministry authority and could be disciplined or removed if their behavior conflicted with official policy or administrative directives. The confrontation between traditional educational authority and bureaucratic power would serve as demonstration of changing relationships within magical society. The student response to her appointment ranged from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility, reflecting broader social tensions about government expansion into previously autonomous institutions, while providing early indication of resistance strategies that would require systematic countermeasures to prevent development of organized opposition to her authority and educational policies. The generational conflict represented in miniature the broader struggle between established traditions and authoritarian innovation. Her first weeks at Hogwarts were dedicated to careful assessment of institutional dynamics and individual personalities that would determine her approach to consolidating power while neutralizing sources of opposition that could threaten her ability to implement planned reforms through peaceful, administrative processes rather than confrontational methods that might attract unwanted attention from ministry oversight or public criticism. The educational policies she implemented reflected decades of resentment about her own school experiences, combined with ideological commitment to hierarchical social structure that placed ministry authority above traditional academic freedom and individual student development. Her approach to teaching represented systematic attempt to transform magical education from exploration of possibilities into indoctrination, in submission to established authority and acceptance of limitations determined by birth rather than merit or effort. But perhaps most significantly, her appointment to Hogwarts provided platform for the systematic cruelty that had always been latent in her character, but which previous positions hadn't offered sufficient scope for full expression. The combination of official authority and vulnerable target population created conditions where sadistic impulses could be indulged while maintaining appearance of legitimate disciplinary action and educational policy implementation. The stage was set for confrontation that would expose both the limits of institutional authority and the depths of individual corruption, while providing lessons about resistance and collaboration that would influence magical society for generations to come. The pink-clad bureaucrat who had spent decades climbing ministry hierarchy through manipulation and strategic positioning was finally positioned to implement her vision of proper magical society through methods that would reveal the true nature of power without moral constraint or ethical limitation. The Great Hall of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had witnessed centuries of opening feasts, but the tension that filled the ancient space on the first night of the 1995 term was unlike anything in its storied history, as students and faculty alike sensed that fundamental changes were coming to their beloved institution through forces beyond their control or understanding. The familiar comfort of house tables laden with traditional foods and the warmth of floating candles could not dispel the atmosphere of unease that had settled over the castle like an oppressive fog, thick with implications that no one dared to articulate openly. Albus Dumbledore stood at the staff table with his customary dignity intact, but his usual twinkling demeanor subdued by concerns that extended far beyond the normal challenges of educational administration, his blue eyes reflecting awareness of political pressures that threatened to transform Hogwarts from sanctuary of learning into battleground for ideological control over magical Britain's future generations. The headmaster's opening remarks were carefully measured to avoid provocation while maintaining his commitment to truth and academic freedom, but even his diplomatic language could not conceal the reality that external forces were moving to assert unprecedented control over the school's operations. When he introduced Dolores Umbridge as the new defense against the dark arts professor, the polite applause that greeted her appointment carried undertones of uncertainty and suspicion that reflected the student body's intuitive understanding that something fundamental had changed in their world, though they could not yet comprehend the scope of transformation that her presence represented. Her pink cardigan and matching bow seemed almost aggressively cheerful in the context of the Great Hall's ancient grandeur, creating visual discord that served as harbinger of deeper conflicts to come. The interruption of Dumbledore's speech by a subordinate professor was so unprecedented that it left the entire assembly momentarily speechless, as centuries of institutional protocol and basic courtesy were swept aside by someone whose sense of authority transcended traditional academic hierarchies and proper educational conduct. The sound of her throat clearing echoed through the suddenly silent hall like the crack of a whip, commanding attention through sheer audacity rather than earned respect or institutional position. Her speech to the assembled students was delivered with the patronizing tone typically reserved for addressing very young children or individuals of severely limited intelligence, each word carefully chosen to convey both superficial warmth and underlying threat to anyone perceptive enough to read between the lines of her saccharine presentation. The content of her remarks, focused on progress and pruning, and the ministry's protective oversight, carried implications that chilled faculty members who understood the political context, while puzzling students whose experience with bureaucratic euphemism was still developing. The laughter that rippled through the student body during her address was not born from amusement, but from nervous recognition that they were witnessing something simultaneously absurd and ominous, as their natural irreverence toward authority figures clashed with dawning awareness that this particular authority figure represented forces that could not be dismissed or deflected through traditional student resistance methods. The giggles died away quickly as the implications of her words began to penetrate even the most politically naive minds in the audience. Professor McGonagall's reaction to the interruption was visible to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signs of her displeasure, her lips compressed into the thinnest line imaginable, while her eyes flashed with indignation that was all the more powerful for being rigidly controlled through years of professional discipline and Scottish reserve. Her hawk-like stare fixed on the pink-clad interloper with intensity that should have reduced lesser mortals to ash, but Umbridge seemed entirely immune to such displays of righteous anger from her new colleagues. The staff table's collective response ranged from Professor Sprout's raised eyebrows of genteel disapproval to Professor Snape's characteristic sneer of contempt, while Professor Flitwick's normally cheerful demeanor was replaced by expression of concern that reflected his understanding of political implications that extended far beyond simple breaches of academic etiquette. Even the portraits lining the Great Hall's walls seemed to regard the new arrival with suspicion, their painted faces wearing expressions of disapproval that transcended the boundaries between art and life. The first defense against the dark arts lesson, under Professor Umbridge's instruction, established the fundamental parameters of her educational philosophy, while demonstrating her complete contempt for practical magical education and student safety in ways that would have scandalized any genuine educator who understood the subject's critical importance for young witches and wizards. The classroom atmosphere she created was oppressive in its artificial cheerfulness, with pink decorations and kitten plates that created cognitive dissonance between appearance and reality that would become her signature method of psychological control. Her insistence that students address her with elaborate courtesy while she spoke to them with condescending sweetness established power dynamics that inverted traditional educational relationships, where respect was earned through knowledge and competence, rather than demanded through bureaucratic authority and threats of punishment. The students' confusion about appropriate responses to her teaching methods reflected broader uncertainty about how to navigate relationships with adults whose behavior defied normal expectations of professional conduct and educational purpose. The revelation that wands would not be permitted during defense against the dark arts classes created immediate uproar among students who understood intuitively that magical education without magical practice was not just ineffective but actively dangerous, leaving them unprepared for threats that required practical defensive capabilities rather than theoretical knowledge alone. The policy represented such fundamental misunderstanding of educational principles that even first years recognized its absurdity, though they lacked vocabulary to articulate their objections effectively. Her criticism of previous defense against the dark arts instructors revealed both her ignorance about the subject matter and her willingness to disparage respected educators whose qualifications vastly exceeded her own, while simultaneously demonstrating the political motivations behind her appointment and her role as ministry representative rather than genuine teacher committed to student welfare and educational excellence. The systematic attack on Professor Lupin's reputation was particularly vicious, combining legitimate authority with personal prejudice in ways that foreshadowed broader patterns of discrimination and abuse. Harry Potter's confrontation with her during that first lesson established the battle lines that would define their relationship throughout her tenure at Hogwarts, as his refusal to accept official lies about Voldemort's return collided with her determination to maintain ministry version of events regardless of evidence or student safety considerations. The exchange revealed both his courage in challenging authority and her willingness to punish students for expressing views that contradicted official policy, establishing precedent for increasingly severe responses to any form of dissent or independent thinking. The detention that resulted from Harry's outburst introduced the blood quill as instrument of torture disguised as disciplinary measure, representing escalation from psychological intimidation to actual physical abuse that crossed every boundary of appropriate educational practice, while maintaining facade of legitimate punishment for classroom disruption. The device itself was so obviously designed for causing pain rather than genuine education that its use constituted clear evidence of sadistic motivation concealed behind official authority. The phrase, "I must not tell lies," that was carved into Harry's hand through repeated use of the blood quill carried layers of irony that revealed the depth of Umbridge's psychological corruption as she used accusations of dishonesty to punish someone for telling truth, while she herself built entire career on systematic deception and manipulation of facts to serve personal and political agendas. The permanent scarring that resulted from these sessions would serve as lasting reminder of what happened to students who challenged official authority with inconvenient truths. The appointment as High Inquisitor represented formalization of authority that had already been exercised informally through her teaching position, but the official designation carried expanded powers that allowed systematic evaluation and potential removal of faculty members whose methods or beliefs conflicted with ministry-approved educational standards and ideological requirements. The pink badge that announced her new role was worn with pride that reflected her satisfaction at achieving position where decades of resentment about educational experiences could be transformed into institutional revenge against system that had failed to recognize her supposed superiority. Her evaluation of established faculty members was conducted with barely concealed hostility that made mockery of any pretense of objective assessment or educational improvement, as personal prejudices and political motivations determined outcomes that bore no relationship to actual teaching effectiveness or student benefit. The intimidation tactics she employed during these sessions were designed to establish dominance rather than gather information, creating an atmosphere of fear that would discourage resistance to her expanding control over educational content and institutional culture. Professor Trelawney became particular target for humiliation due to her vulnerability as practitioner of subject that was easily ridiculed, and her lack of political connections that might provide protection from bureaucratic harassment and professional assassination. The public nature of her dismissal was calculated to demonstrate consequences of failing to meet new standards while sending message to other faculty members about potential fate awaiting anyone who challenged or criticized the changing educational environment. The attempt to remove Professor Trelawney from Hogwarts grounds entirely revealed overreach that even Umbridge's expanded authority could not legally support, providing Dumbledore with opportunity to demonstrate that some limits still existed on ministry power within educational institutions while maintaining his own position through careful navigation of jurisdictional boundaries and legal technicalities. The confrontation established that resistance was still possible for those with sufficient knowledge and courage to challenge bureaucratic intimidation through proper channels. The introduction of Firenze as replacement divination instructor represented calculated insult that combined species prejudice with strategic positioning of vulnerable faculty member whose legal status as centaur made him particularly susceptible to harassment and potential removal through regulations governing non-human employment in educational institutions. Her barely concealed disgust at his appointment reflected broader attitudes toward magical creatures that would later manifest in more systematic persecution of those she considered racially inferior. The formation of Dumbledore's army represented direct challenge to her educational authority, an attempt to prevent student preparation for threats that official policy insisted did not exist, creating conflict between institutional loyalty and student safety that would test every participant's commitment to truth over convenience and courage over compliance with unjust authority. The secret nature of the organization was necessitated by increasingly oppressive atmosphere that made legitimate educational activities seem like seditious conspiracy against established government. The discovery of the illegal study group through her network of informants and surveillance methods demonstrated both her paranoid attention to potential resistance and her willingness to use students as agents against their classmates, corrupting educational relationships through introduction of espionage and betrayal that transformed school environment into police state where trust became dangerous luxury that few could afford to maintain. The systematic destruction of community bonds was perhaps her most damaging legacy, creating suspicion and isolation that would persist long after her departure. Educational Decree No. 23, which banned all student organizations not explicitly approved by the High Inquisitor, represented attempt to control every aspect of student life while eliminating potential sources of resistance or alternative authority that might challenge her expanding power over educational content and institutional culture. The sweeping nature of the regulation demonstrated contempt for student autonomy and traditional educational values that had emphasized development of leadership skills and collaborative learning through extracurricular activities. Her selective enforcement of the new regulations, permitting Slytherin activities to continue while scrutinizing other houses' organizations, revealed political motivations behind policies presented as educational improvements and demonstrated favoritism that undermined any pretense of fairness or institutional neutrality in administrative decisions. The discrimination was so obvious that even students began to understand that justice had been replaced by political calculation in educational governance. The inquisitorial squad represented institutionalization of student collaboration with oppressive authority through creation of official positions that rewarded betrayal of classmates and enforcement of increasingly harsh disciplinary measures against those whose behavior conflicted with new standards of acceptable conduct and political orthodoxy. The badges worn by squad members became symbols of shame that marked their wearers as collaborators in systematic destruction of educational community and traditional values. Her interception of student mail represented violation of privacy rights that extended ministry surveillance into most personal communications, demonstrating paranoid need to control information while gathering intelligence about resistance activities and family attitudes that might influence student behavior in ways that conflicted with her educational and political objectives. The damage inflicted on Hedwig during one such interception revealed willingness to harm innocent creatures in pursuit of her surveillance goals. The attempted capture of Sirius Black through monitoring Harry's communications demonstrated how educational authority was being perverted to serve broader political objectives that had nothing to do with student welfare or legitimate educational purposes, as her position at Hogwarts was used to advance ministry law enforcement goals through methods that endangered students while violating every principle of appropriate institutional conduct and professional responsibility. The escalating punishments imposed on students who challenged her authority or violated her expanding list of regulations revealed sadistic pleasure in causing pain while maintaining facade of legitimate disciplinary action, as detentions with the blood quill became routine responses to increasingly minor infractions that would previously have merited no more than verbal warnings or brief loss of privileges. The systematic nature of the abuse suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous reactions to student misbehavior. Her confrontation with Professor McGonagall over career counseling revealed both her determination to destroy student aspirations that conflicted with her assessment of appropriate social hierarchy and the limits of her ability to intimidate faculty members whose professional integrity, institutional knowledge exceeded her own bureaucratic authority and political connections. The exchange demonstrated that resistance was still possible for those with sufficient courage and competence to challenge her expanding tyranny. The Weasley twins' rebellion represented a different form of resistance that used humor and chaos to undermine her authority, while demonstrating that student creativity and determination could find ways to challenge even systematic oppression through methods that were difficult to prevent or punish through conventional disciplinary measures. Their final departure from Hogwarts became legend that inspired others to find their own ways of resisting institutional tyranny while maintaining their dignity and values. The swamp they created in the corridor became symbol of natural forces reasserting themselves against artificial control, as their magical creation proved impossible for her to remove despite her expanded authority and bureaucratic resources, demonstrating limits of administrative power when confronted by determined resistance and superior magical ability applied with creative intelligence and collaborative planning. Peeves's campaign of harassment, encouraged by the departing twins, represented institution itself rejecting her presence through its most chaotic and uncontrollable element, as the poltergeist's activities created atmosphere of constant disruption that made normal educational activities impossible, while demonstrating that some forces within Hogwarts would never submit to external authority regardless of official appointments or legal mandates. The systematic breakdown of discipline and order that characterized her final weeks as headmistress revealed that authority based solely on fear and bureaucratic power was ultimately unsustainable when confronted by widespread resistance from community members who refused to accept illegitimate control over their educational institution and traditional way of life. The chaos that engulfed the castle became visible manifestation of moral and institutional corruption that had been imposed from outside. Her attempt to use the illegal Cruciatus curse on students represented complete abandonment of any pretense of legitimate educational purpose or appropriate professional conduct, revealing the sadistic nature that had always lurked beneath her bureaucratic facade, while demonstrating how institutional power could corrupt individuals who lacked moral constraints or ethical foundations to prevent abuse of vulnerable populations under their authority. The confrontation in the Forbidden Forest that ended her reign of terror at Hogwarts represented poetic justice, as her prejudices and cruelty finally encountered forces that would not be intimidated by bureaucratic authority or impressed by official titles, while her treatment by the centaurs provided harsh lesson about consequences of racism and abuse of power when applied to beings whose patience and forbearance had been exhausted by systematic persecution and insult. Her departure from Hogwarts in disgrace marked end of darkest period in the school's recent history, while providing lessons about vigilance against tyranny and importance of resistance to illegitimate authority that would influence generations of students who had witnessed firsthand how Quickly, educational institutions could be corrupted by external political forces and internal collaboration with oppressive systems. The legacy of her time at Hogwarts would persist in scars, both physical and psychological, that marked those who had suffered under her regime, while also demonstrating that communities united in defense of their values and traditions could ultimately prevail against systematic oppression when they maintained courage to resist and willingness to pay whatever price such resistance demanded from individuals and institutions alike. The darkness that settled over Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry on that fateful June evening carried with it the weight of accumulated tensions and suppressed resistance that had been building throughout Dolores Umbridge's reign of terror, as students and faculty alike sensed that the carefully maintained facade of educational authority was finally cracking under the pressure of its own contradictions and the relentless opposition of those who refused to submit to tyrannical control disguised as institutional improvement and ministerial oversight. The discovery of Harry Potter in her office, attempting to use the Flu network for unauthorized communication with persons unknown, represented the culmination of months of surveillance and investigation that had consumed increasing portions of her time and attention as she worked to uncover the full extent of student resistance activities and identify all participants in what she had come to view as coordinated conspiracy against legitimate educational authority and ministry policy regarding proper magical instruction and social order. Her inquisitorial squad had performed their duties with enthusiasm that reflected both their genuine belief in her cause and their understanding that cooperation would be rewarded while opposition would be punished through methods that had already been demonstrated on numerous occasions throughout the academic year. The capture of Harry Potter and his associates represented validation of her surveillance methods while providing opportunity to extract information about broader resistance networks that might extend beyond Hogwarts into adult wizarding society. The students who found themselves dragged into her pink-decorated office that evening represented cross-section of houses and backgrounds, united only by their willingness to challenge her authority and their refusal to accept official versions of events that contradicted their own observations and moral convictions. Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Ronald Weasley, Ginny Weasley, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood had all demonstrated various forms of resistance to her educational policies, making their capture particularly satisfying for someone who viewed student opposition as personal insult, requiring immediate and decisive response. The interrogation that followed their apprehension revealed both the depth of her paranoia about student activities and her growing desperation to maintain control over situations that were increasingly beyond her ability to manage through conventional disciplinary measures and bureaucratic authority. Her questions focused obsessively on communication methods and contact networks, reflecting understanding that her enemies extended far beyond the school's walls into organizations and individuals whose opposition threatened not just her educational reforms but her broader political objectives. Her demand that Harry reveal the purpose of his unauthorized communication attempt was delivered with false sweetness that barely concealed the rage and frustration that had been building throughout months of systematic resistance to her authority. As students found increasingly creative ways to undermine her policies while avoiding direct confrontation that might provide justification for the harsh punishments she was eager to impose on anyone who challenged her expanding power over educational content and institutional culture. The office itself had been transformed into shrine to her own authority and aesthetic preferences, with pink furnishings and kitten imagery creating atmosphere that was simultaneously childish and threatening, as the incongruity between decoration and purpose served to emphasize the psychological instability of someone who could combine genuine appreciation for cute imagery with systematic cruelty toward vulnerable students whose only crime was refusing to accept lies as truth. Her collection of disciplinary files and surveillance reports covered every surface not occupied by decorative plates and frilly accessories, creating visual representation of the police state she had created within what should have been sanctuary of learning and intellectual development. The meticulous organization of her persecution records demonstrated obsessive attention to detail that revealed paranoid personality traits and vindictive motivations that extended far beyond legitimate educational concerns. When her initial interrogation methods failed to produce desired confessions and information about broader resistance activities, her frustration manifested in increasingly aggressive behavior that stripped away remaining pretenses of professional conduct and educational purpose, revealing the sadistic nature that had always lurked beneath her bureaucratic facade, but which institutional constraints had previously forced her to conceal behind appropriate administrative language and regulatory justifications. Her decision to resort to veritaserum represented escalation from psychological intimidation to chemical coercion that violated every principle of educational ethics and student rights, while demonstrating her willingness to use any means necessary to extract information that might serve her personal and political objectives, regardless of legality or moral considerations that would constrain administrators with functional conscience and respect for human dignity. Professor Snape's intervention in this process, through his claim that ministry supplies of truth serum had been exhausted, represented subtle form of resistance that demonstrated how even faculty members who supported authoritarian approaches to discipline recognized that certain boundaries should not be crossed in dealing with students whose opposition was based on principle rather than mere rebelliousness or disrespect for legitimate authority. The revelation of her willingness to use the Cruciatus Curse on students marked complete abandonment of any pretense of legitimate educational purpose or appropriate professional conduct, as she prepared to employ torture methods that were legally classified as unforgivable and morally recognized as inexcusable, regardless of circumstances or justifications that might be offered by those who viewed opposition as treason, requiring extreme responses. Her rationalization of illegal torture through appeal to necessity and national security demonstrated psychological mechanisms that allowed otherwise intelligent individuals to justify atrocities through ideological frameworks that redefined cruelty as duty and sadism as patriotic service to larger causes that transcended individual rights or human dignity. The casual nature of her preparation for torturing children revealed depths of corruption that exceeded anything previously witnessed at Hogwarts. Hermione Granger's desperate intervention, offering to reveal location of alleged weapon that Dumbledore had supposedly hidden for use against Ministry forces, represented quick thinking under extreme pressure that exploited Umbridge's paranoid assumptions about resistance activities while providing potential escape route for herself and her friends through deception that played on their brains, captors' fears and prejudices about opposition, capabilities and intentions. The fabricated story about Dumbledore's secret weapon appealed to conspiracy theories that Umbridge had been developing throughout her tenure at Hogwarts, as her interpretation of student resistance activities had gradually expanded to encompass belief in coordinated adult supervision and sophisticated planning that justified increasingly harsh countermeasures and systematic persecution of anyone associated with opposition to her authority or ministry policy regarding educational content and institutional control. Her eager acceptance of Hermione's story without verification or critical analysis demonstrated how paranoid assumptions could override rational skepticism when dealing with information that confirmed existing prejudices and, quote, fears, while her immediate decision to investigate personally rather than summoning additional assistance, revealed dangerous combination of overconfidence and desperate need to personally control every aspect of situations that threatened her authority or challenged her carefully constructed version of events. The journey into the Forbidden Forest represented physical and symbolic movement from institutional setting where her authority was recognized and supported by official position into natural environment where bureaucratic power meant nothing and different forms of justice and social organization prevailed according to principles that predated human magical society and transcended political boundaries that defined her sphere of influence and control. The forest itself seemed to respond to their presence with increasing hostility as they moved deeper into territory that belonged to creatures whose relationship with human magical society was complex and often antagonistic, reflecting centuries of discrimination and exploitation that had created lasting resentment toward representatives of wizard government and institutional authority who attempted to impose their values and regulations on autonomous magical communities. Her behavior during the forest expedition revealed character traits that had been shaped by years of institutional power, but which proved entirely unsuitable for environments where success required cooperation, respect for others, and understanding of different cultural values and social structures. Her automatic assumption of authority over situations she didn't understand, and her condescending attitude toward beings she considered inferior demonstrated prejudices that would prove catastrophically inappropriate for current circumstances. The encounter with centaur herds represented collision between two incompatible worldviews and social systems, as her bureaucratic approach to problem-solving met indigenous authority structures that operated according to principles of honor, territory, and collective justice that had evolved independently from human magical institutions, and which could not be manipulated through official titles or ministerial appointments that carried no weight in this ancient community. Her immediate resort to species-based insults and attempts to assert dominance through appeals to wizarding superiority demonstrated complete failure to understand either diplomatic requirements of her situation or cultural sensitivities of beings whose cooperation was essential for safe passage through territory they controlled according to agreements that predated ministry authority and which recognized centaur sovereignty over forest lands and magical creatures who lived within their protection. The term half-breed that she applied to centaurs carried historical weight of discrimination and dehumanization that these proud beings had endured for centuries from wizard authorities who viewed any form of ND, non-human intelligence, as inherently inferior and potentially threatening to established social hierarchies that placed pure-blood wizards at apex of magical society and relegated all others to subordinate positions that denied their autonomy and dignity. Her comment about centaur intelligence levels, delivered with characteristic condescending tone that had served her well in intimidating students and junior faculty, represented such profound cultural insensitivity and personal insult that it guaranteed hostile response from beings whose honor and reputation were fundamental to their social structure and individual identity in ways that someone from her background could never understand or appreciate. The arrow that clipped her hair served as warning that her usual methods of intimidation and control were not only ineffective but actively dangerous in this environment, where physical courage and martial skills were valued over bureaucratic maneuvering and where insults to collective honor required immediate response according to cultural traditions that prioritize justice over diplomacy and direct action over institutional process. Her reaction to this warning shot, which included nervous laughter and attempts to maintain authority through continued verbal aggression demonstrated complete inability to adapt her behavior to changing circumstances or recognize when strategic retreat might be more appropriate than continued confrontation with opponents whose capabilities and motivations she had fundamentally misunderstood from the beginning of their encounter. The Centaur's decision to take her captive represented application of their own justice system to behavior that violated their territorial sovereignty and cultural dignity, while her capture also served their broader political interests in demonstrating to wizard authorities that certain boundaries could not be crossed without consequences that transcended ministry power and bureaucratic influence to encompass forms of retribution that operated outside human legal systems. Her treatment during captivity reflected Centaur approaches to dealing with prisoners who had violated their laws and insulted their people, methods that emphasized psychological rather than physical punishment, but which were designed to ensure that captured enemies would never again pose threat to Centaur security or dignity through either direct action or encouragement of similar behavior from other wizard authorities who might consider forest territory subject to their jurisdiction. The binding that held her helpless in Centaur custody was both practical restraint preventing escape and symbolic demonstration of reversal in power relationships. As someone who had spent months controlling every aspect of other people's lives, found herself completely subject to decisions made by beings she had considered inferior and whose authority she had refused to recognize until circumstances made such recognition irrelevant to her immediate survival needs. Her psychological state during captivity deteriorated rapidly as the reality of her powerlessness became impossible to deny or rationalize through appeals to bureaucratic authority or ministry policy that carried no weight with captors, whose political systems operated according to entirely different principles and whose justice was dispensed through methods that prioritized collective welfare over individual rights or procedural safeguards. The trauma she experienced from prolonged helplessness and constant threat of execution served as harsh education in vulnerability and fear that she had systematically inflicted on others throughout her career, providing perspective on power, relationships, and abuse of authority that might have produced personal growth in someone capable of self-reflection and moral development, but which instead created additional layers of resentment and paranoid suspicion. Dumbledore's eventual intervention to secure her release demonstrated both his continuing influence with magical creatures who respected his reputation for fairness and his commitment to protecting even those who had systematically opposed him and endangered his students through their abuse of institutional authority and personal vendetta disguised as educational policy and administrative reform. The negotiations required for her freedom involved complex diplomatic considerations that reflected broader political relationships between human wizard government and autonomous magical communities, whose cooperation was essential for maintaining stability and preventing conflicts that could expose magical society to Muggle observation while creating internal divisions that would benefit dark wizards seeking to exploit social tensions for their own purposes. Her return to human society was marked by psychological damage that manifested in various forms of anxiety and paranoia that exceeded even her previous levels of suspicious behavior and controlling tendencies, as the experience of complete powerlessness had shattered illusions about institutional authority and personal invulnerability that had sustained her throughout decades of bureaucratic advancement and political maneuvering. The hospital wing at Hogwarts provided temporary refuge where her physical injuries could be treated and her immediate psychological needs could be addressed. But the deeper trauma of her forest experience would require extensive healing that her personality was fundamentally unsuited to accept or process through normal therapeutic methods that required acknowledgement of personal responsibility and willingness to change behavior patterns that had created current difficulty. Her reaction to sounds that reminded her of centaur movements, particularly the clip-clopping noises that Ron Weasley deliberately produced to torment her during his own medical treatment, demonstrated how thoroughly the experience had penetrated her psychological defenses and created lasting vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who understood the nature of her trauma and chose to use such knowledge for purposes of revenge or intimidation. The medical staff's observations of her condition during recovery revealed someone whose carefully constructed facade of competence and authority had been completely shattered by encounter with forces beyond her control or understanding, leaving behind frightened individual whose previous confidence had been revealed as elaborate performance designed to convince herself as much as others of her strength and invulnerability. Her departure from Hogwarts represented complete failure of everything she had hoped to achieve through her appointment to educational positions that she had viewed as opportunities to remake magical society according to her own prejudices and authoritarian instincts, while her disgraceful exit served as warning to future administrators about potential consequences of abusing institutional power for personal gratification and political advancement. The manner of her leaving, attempting to sneak away during dinner to avoid public acknowledgement of her defeat, demonstrated how thoroughly her arrogance had been replaced by shame and fear of confronting consequences of her actions. While Peeves's final harassment provided appropriate conclusion to reign of terror that had been characterized by systematic cruelty disguised as legitimate authority and educational improvement, the walking stick that Peeves used to chase her from the premises, which observers recognized as belonging to Professor McGonagall, served as symbol of institutional justice, finally asserting itself through unconventional means when conventional channels had proven inadequate for dealing with abuse of power that had been protected by official appointment and ministerial support from administrators who valued political loyalty over educational competence or basic human decency. Her legacy at Hogwarts would persist in memories of students and faculty who had witnessed systematic transformation of educational environment into police state, while her methods and their ultimate failure provided lessons about resistance to tyranny and importance of maintaining moral courage when confronted by illegitimate authority that demanded submission through fear rather than earning respect through competence and ethical behavior. The scars she left on individual students, particularly Harry Potter, whose hand would forever bear evidence of her cruelty, served as permanent reminders of what could happen when institutional power was wielded by individuals whose personal, psychological problems and ideological extremism were given free rein through official positions that should have been reserved for those with genuine commitment to education and student welfare rather than personal advancement and political agenda. The aftermath of Voldemort's return to corporeal form and the subsequent exposure of the Ministry's year-long campaign of denial created political upheaval that reverberated through every level of magical government, as careers built on maintaining comfortable lies crumbled beneath the weight of undeniable evidence, while opportunistic officials scrambled to distance themselves from policies they had enthusiastically supported when such support seemed politically advantageous and professionally rewarding. In this climate of recrimination and desperate repositioning, Dolores Umbridge found herself uniquely positioned to survive and even prosper, as her particular combination of bureaucratic competence and moral flexibility made her valuable to new leadership that prioritized effectiveness over ethical consistency. Cornelius Fudge's resignation in disgrace opened opportunities for ambitious underlings who had demonstrated loyalty to institutional power rather than individual personalities, making Dolores's survival through the transition appear less like personal failure and more like professional pragmatism that recognized the difference between temporary political appointments and permanent bureaucratic positions that transcended electoral cycles and ministerial changes. Her careful cultivation of relationships throughout the ministry hierarchy served her well during this period of reorganization and personnel evaluation. Rufus Scrimgeour's appointment as minister represented shift toward more militaristic approach to magical governance that valued results over process and security over individual rights, creating environment where Dolores's authoritarian instincts and willingness to employ harsh measures could be reframed as assets rather than liabilities in face of genuine external threats that required decisive action from officials who understood the difference between peacetime luxury of moral squeamishness and wartime necessity of practical solutions. The new minister's initial assessment of existing ministry personnel focused on identifying individuals whose capabilities and temperament suited them for expanded security responsibilities that would be required during the coming conflict, while simultaneously purging those whose previous association with failed policies made them political liabilities, regardless of their competence or dedication to public service. Dolores's survival through this winnowing process reflected both her bureaucratic skills and her ability to position herself as solution rather than problem. Her reinstatement to senior administrative positions within the ministry represented recognition that institutional memory and operational expertise could not be easily replaced during periods of crisis, even when such expertise came packaged with personality traits and behavioral patterns that might be considered problematic under normal circumstances. The pressing need for experienced administrators who could implement policy efficiently overrode concerns about methods that might be employed in pursuit of officially sanctioned objectives. But perhaps more significantly, Scrimgeour's administration discovered that public opinion regarding appropriate responses to dark arts threats had shifted dramatically following confirmation of Voldemort's return, with previously controversial enforcement methods now viewed as reasonable precautions rather than authoritarian overreach by citizens who understood that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures from those charged with protecting magical society from existential threats. The failure to prosecute her for documented abuses at Hogwarts reflected both the political calculations of the new administration and the broader legal challenges of addressing past misconduct when current circumstances required focus on future threats rather than historical justice. Scrimgeour's decision to retain her services while acknowledging their problematic nature created precedent for prioritizing effectiveness over accountability that would have lasting implications for magical governance. Harry Potter's refusal to cooperate with ministry public relations efforts was influenced significantly by his personal experience with Dolores's methods and his understanding that her continued employment represented institutional tolerance for abuse that contradicted official rhetoric about protecting magical society from tyrannical forces. His rejection of Scrimgeour's overtures demonstrated how individual experiences with bureaucratic corruption could undermine broader political objectives that required public trust and voluntary cooperation. The scar on Harry's hand that served as permanent reminder of her cruelty became symbol of ministry's willingness to sacrifice individual dignity for administrative convenience, while his decision to display it publicly during his meeting with the minister represented powerful indictment of institutional values that placed political expedience above justice for victims of official misconduct and systematic abuse of authority. Scrimgeour's recognition that retaining Dolores created ongoing political liability for his administration's credibility demonstrated the long-term costs of short-term pragmatic decisions, but the immediate pressures of organizing effective resistance to Voldemort's expanding influence made such considerations secondary to operational requirements that demanded experienced personnel regardless of their past behavior or current reputation among those they had previously victimized. The period between Scrimgeour's appointment and Voldemort's eventual takeover of magical government represented brief interlude during which traditional institutional structures maintained facade of normalcy while adapting to wartime conditions that gradually eroded civil liberties and democratic oversight in name of security measures that proved inadequate for addressing threats they were designed to counter through conventional law enforcement and regulatory authority. Dolores's role during this transitional period involved coordination of security policies that expanded surveillance capabilities and enforcement authority, while maintaining appearance of legal continuity and constitutional governance that concealed extent to which emergency measures were fundamentally altering relationship between magical government and citizens whose rights were being systematically curtailed through bureaucratic processes rather than dramatic legislative changes. Her expertise in regulatory interpretation and policy implementation made her valuable for developing legal frameworks that could justify extraordinary measures through technical compliance with existing statutes and constitutional provisions, while her experience in managing institutional resistance provided insights into methods for overcoming opposition from civil liberties, advocates, and traditional supporters of limited government who failed to appreciate evolving security requirements. The administrative efficiency she brought to these tasks was undeniable, as policies that might have required months of development and implementation under normal circumstances were drafted, approved, and enforced within weeks through streamlined processes that eliminated consultation periods and appeal procedures that had previously protected individual rights from bureaucratic overreach and administrative error. But the true test of her adaptability came with Voldemort's successful infiltration and eventual control of magical government, as the institutional structures she had served throughout her career were systematically corrupted and redirected toward purposes that represented complete inversion of their original functions, while maintaining surface appearances of legitimate authority and legal process that concealed revolutionary changes in power, relationships, and social organization. The Dark Lord's approach to governmental control reflected sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic psychology and institutional inertia, recognizing that existing administrative structures could be more easily subverted than replaced, while personnel who had demonstrated willingness to follow orders regardless of their moral implications were more valuable than ideological converts whose commitment might waver when practical consequences of their beliefs became personally costly or socially dangerous. Pius Thickness's appointment as puppet minister represented masterpiece of political theatre that provided legitimacy for policies that would have been immediately recognized as tyrannical if implemented by obvious Death Eater leadership, while his imperious-induced compliance with Voldemort's directives created appearance of voluntary governmental transformation that made resistance seem like sedition rather than patriotic duty to oppose illegitimate authority. The evaluation of existing ministry personnel by senior Death Eaters revealed the disturbing extent to which bureaucratic culture had prepared ordinary officials for collaboration with totalitarian government, as years of following orders without moral reflection had created institutional environment where adaptation to new leadership required minimal psychological adjustment for those whose primary loyalty was to their positions rather than principles or people they supposedly served. Dolores's assessment by these new authorities proved remarkably favorable, as her documented willingness to employ harsh measures against political opposition, her systematic approach to persecution of targeted groups, and her bureaucratic competence in implementing discriminatory policies aligned perfectly with organizational needs of regime that required effective administrators capable of translating ideological objectives into operational reality through existing governmental mechanisms. Her reappointment to senior position within the transformed ministry represented recognition that institutional knowledge and administrative skills could serve any political system equally well when divorced from moral constraints or ethical considerations that might prevent efficient implementation of policies that served power rather than justice or truth. The ease of her transition from democratic government to authoritarian regime revealed disturbing truths about bureaucratic loyalty and professional identity. The expansion of her authority under the new system included appointment as head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission, a position that combined her existing expertise in regulatory enforcement with broader responsibilities for implementing racial policies that represented systematic institutionalization of prejudices she had harbored throughout her career, but which previous governmental systems had prevented her from expressing through official channels. The commission itself represented bureaucratic approach to genocide that substituted administrative efficiency for dramatic violence, while achieving similar results through legal mechanisms that provided appearance of due process and regulatory compliance, even as they facilitated systematic persecution and elimination of targeted populations through methods that maintained plausible deniability and institutional distance from ultimate consequences of policies. Her supervision of commission operations demonstrated characteristic attention to procedural detail and administrative thoroughness that had marked her entire career. As she approached the systematic persecution of Muggle-born wizards with same methodical precision she had previously brought to educational reform and regulatory enforcement, viewing human suffering as administrative challenge requiring efficient solutions rather than moral crisis demanding compassionate response. The hearings conducted under her authority represented perversion of judicial process that maintained surface appearance of legal proceedings, while predetermined outcomes reflected political requirements rather than evidence or law, demonstrating how institutional forms could be preserved, while their substance was completely corrupted through personnel decisions and policy directives that transformed courts into instruments of persecution rather than venues for justice. Her personal conduct during these proceedings revealed sadistic pleasure in exercising power over vulnerable individuals whose circumstances allowed her to inflict psychological torture through legal processes that victims could not challenge or escape, while her official demeanor maintained facade of bureaucratic neutrality that concealed personal motivations and ideological commitments that drove her enthusiasm for the Commission's work. The acquisition of Alastor Moody's magical eye following his death during the Battle of the Seven Potters represented both practical security enhancement and symbolic appropriation of moral authority from someone whose reputation for justice and dedication to protecting innocent people contrasted sharply with her own record of institutional abuse and systematic cruelty disguised as legitimate governmental function. The installation of the eye in her office door served multiple purposes beyond simple surveillance, as its presence communicated both her access to advanced magical detection capabilities and her willingness to violate the dignity of fallen heroes, whose sacrifice in service of justice was reduced to trophy status in service of policies they had died opposing. The psychological impact on ministry employees who recognized the eye's source was precisely what she intended. Her use of the eye for monitoring subordinates' activities and detecting potential resistance among ministry personnel demonstrated paranoid approach to internal security that reflected both practical understanding of institutional vulnerability to sabotage and personal psychological needs for complete control over environments where she exercised authority, making surveillance as much about personal gratification as operational necessity. The encounter with Mundungus Fletcher in Diagon Alley provided opportunity to combine official enforcement duties with personal acquisition of items that enhanced her social position and bureaucratic authority, as she used her expanded police powers to extract tribute from petty criminals whose violations provided pretexts for confiscation of property that served her aesthetic preferences and status requirements. The locket that she appropriated from Fletcher carried significance that transcended its obvious value as piece of jewelry, though her ignorance of its true nature as Horcrux meant that she viewed it primarily as symbol of pure blood heritage that could enhance her carefully constructed identity and provide additional credibility for claims about family background that she had been maintaining throughout her career through systematic deception and strategic omission. Her belief that the locket's S insignia connected her to the Selwyn family represented continuation of lifelong pattern of identity fraud and genealogical fabrication that had enabled her social advancement through pure blood society despite her actual mixed heritage, while her public claims about this connection demonstrated confidence that her position protected her from investigation or challenge of such obviously false assertions about family relationships. The Horcrux's influence on her psychological state proved minimal compared to its effects on other individuals who had possessed it, suggesting that her existing moral corruption had already achieved levels that made additional degradation barely noticeable, while potentially enhancing capabilities that aligned with the dark magic contained within Voldemort's soul, fragment embedded in the ancient Slytherin artifact. The trials she conducted while wearing the locket represented peak of her administrative career in terms of both authority wielded and human suffering inflicted, as she systematically processed innocent Muggle-born wizards through legal proceedings designed to justify their imprisonment in Azkaban, or worse fates that awaited those whom bureaucratic efficiency condemned through procedural mechanisms rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing or criminal activity. Her personal satisfaction with these proceedings was obvious to observers, who noted her increasingly animated demeanor and obvious pleasure in pronouncing sentences that would destroy lives and families, while her official reports emphasized statistical achievements and processing efficiency that translated human tragedy into numerical targets and administrative performance metrics that demonstrated her value to superiors who measured success through quantitative rather than qualitative criteria. The systematic nature of her persecution campaign required coordination with multiple government departments and extensive documentation that created permanent record of policies that would later serve as evidence for war crimes, prosecutions, though her confidence in regime's permanence led her to maintain detailed records that she viewed as professional achievements rather than potential evidence of criminal activity that might someday be used against her. Her office during this period became shrine to bureaucratic power and administrative authority that reflected both her aesthetic preferences and psychological needs for environmental control, as pink decorations and kitten imagery provided continuity with previous positions, while new additions emphasized her expanded authority and access to confiscated property from victims whose persecution had enhanced her material circumstances, and social position. The staff members who worked under her supervision during this period represented mixture of true believers who shared her ideological commitments and pragmatic collaborators who adapted their behavior to workplace requirements regardless of personal feelings about policies they helped implement, demonstrating how institutional structures could facilitate participation in systematic persecution through division of labor that distributed moral responsibility among numerous individuals. Her management style during this period emphasized efficiency and compliance with directives from higher authority, while maintaining strict control over subordinates whose personal doubts or ethical concerns might interfere with operational effectiveness, creating workplace environment where questioning of policies or procedures was treated as disloyalty rather than legitimate professional concern about legal or moral implications of assigned duties. The transformation of ordinary governmental functions into instruments of persecution demonstrated how quickly institutional purposes could be corrupted when personnel lacked moral foundations or ethical constraints that might prevent participation in activities that violated fundamental principles of justice and human dignity. While administrative competence became weapon against innocent people rather than tool for serving public welfare and maintaining social order. Her personal correspondence during this period revealed satisfaction with professional achievements and social position that had been purchased through systematic collaboration with tyrannical regime, while her private thoughts about victims of her policies demonstrated complete absence of empathy or moral consideration that might have constrained her enthusiasm for duties that others found psychologically difficult or ethically problematic. The systematic approach she brought to persecution of Muggle-born wizards reflected lifetime of preparation for exactly this kind of authority, as previous experiences with educational administration and regulatory enforcement had provided training in methods for controlling vulnerable populations through bureaucratic mechanisms that maintained appearance of legitimacy while serving purposes that had nothing to do with justice, education, or public welfare. Her collaboration with Death Eater leadership revealed alignment between personal prejudices and organizational objectives that made her valuable asset for regime that required administrative competence combined with ideological commitment to racial hierarchy and systematic oppression of targeted populations, while her bureaucratic skills provided efficient mechanisms for translating political objectives into operational reality through existing governmental structures. The period of Voldemort's control over magical government represented fulfillment of her lifelong ambitions for authority and recognition, as she finally achieved position where her natural instincts for control and systematic cruelty could be exercised without institutional constraints or moral oversight that had previously limited scope of her administrative authority and personal satisfaction, with professional accomplishments that served her psychological needs rather than legitimate governmental purposes. But beneath the surface, satisfaction with her enhanced position lay psychological vulnerabilities and emotional dependencies that made her increasingly reliant on external validation and institutional support for maintaining identity, self-worth that were fundamentally dependent on power over others rather than personal achievements or genuine relationships that might have provided more stable foundations for psychological well-being and social identity. The approaching end of Voldemort's regime would test all these dependencies and reveal true extent of her isolation from sources of support that extended beyond immediate political circumstances, while her identification with authoritarian system would make adaptation to post-war democratic restoration virtually impossible for someone whose entire sense of self had become intertwined with institutional power and systematic oppression of vulnerable populations. The morning of September 2nd, 1997, dawned grey and oppressive over a ministry of magic that bore little resemblance to the institution that had governed magical Britain for centuries, its corridors now patrolled by figures whose black robes and silver masks announced their allegiance to forces that had transformed democratic government into instrument of systematic oppression, disguised behind facades of legal continuity and administrative normalcy. The atrium that had once welcomed visitors with golden fountains and cheerful magical displays was now dominated by propaganda sculptures celebrating pure-blood supremacy, while snatchers processed captured Muggle-borns through registration procedures that served as preliminary steps toward imprisonment, torture, and eventual elimination through bureaucratic mechanisms that maintained appearance of judicial process. In this transformed environment, Dolores Umbridge had found her true calling as administrator of policies that aligned perfectly with prejudices and authoritarian instincts that previous governmental systems had constrained through democratic oversight and legal protections that were now dismissed as obstacles to necessary security measures required for protecting magical society from threats both external and internal. Her appointment as head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission represented culmination of career-long preparation for exactly this kind of authority, combining her bureaucratic competence with ideological commitment to racial hierarchy that made her invaluable to regime that required efficient implementation of discriminatory policies through existing institutional structures. The Commission's headquarters occupied floors that had been hastily converted from their previous functions as departments responsible for international cooperation and creature welfare, spaces that now served purposes that inverted their original missions, while maintaining architectural features that reminded observant visitors of more humane purposes these rooms had once served. The transformation reflected broader institutional changes that preserved surface appearances of governmental continuity, while fundamentally altering relationship between magical authority and individual rights that had previously been protected through constitutional principles and legal precedents. Her office during this period represented perfect expression of personality that combined aesthetic preferences with psychological needs for environmental control, as pink decorations and kitten imagery provided continuity with previous positions, while serving to disorient visitors who found cognitive dissonance between childish decor and systematic cruelty that characterized her administrative approach to implementing policies designed to eliminate entire categories of magical citizens through legal processes that maintained facade of due process and regulatory compliance. The Slytherin locket that she wore as symbol of pure blood heritage created focal point for attention from subordinates and visitors whose knowledge of wizarding genealogy might have challenged her claims about family connections if they possessed courage to question someone whose authority could destroy their careers and endanger their families through accusations of disloyalty or insufficient commitment to new governmental priorities that demanded absolute obedience from all ministry personnel. The magical influence emanating from the Horcrux contained within the ancient artifact proved minimal compared to its documented effects on previous bearers, suggesting that her existing moral corruption had already achieved levels that made additional psychological degradation barely noticeable, while potentially enhancing capabilities that aligned with dark magic embedded in Voldemort's soul fragment that now rested against her chest during every moment of her working day. The trials she conducted while wearing the locket represented systematic perversion of judicial procedures that had evolved over centuries to protect innocent people from governmental persecution, as she transformed courtrooms into theaters where predetermined outcomes were achieved through procedural mechanisms that provided appearance of legal compliance while serving political objectives that had nothing to do with justice, evidence, or individual rights that democratic societies recognized as fundamental limitations on state power. Her personal satisfaction with these proceedings was obvious to observers, who noted her increasingly animated demeanor and obvious pleasure in pronouncing sentences that would separate families and destroy lives, while her official reports emphasized statistical achievements and processing efficiency that translated human tragedy into numerical targets and administrative performance metrics that demonstrated her value to superiors who measured success through quantitative rather than qualitative criteria, that ignored moral implications of policies they demanded. The systematic nature of her persecution campaign required coordination with multiple government departments and extensive documentation that created permanent record of activities that would later serve as evidence for war crimes. Prosecutions. Though her confidence in regime's permanence led her to maintain detailed records that she viewed as professional achievements rather than potential evidence of criminal activity that might someday be used against her in legal proceedings, she could not imagine surviving the war's conclusion. The defendants who appeared before her commission represented cross-section of Muggle-born magical society whose only crime was possessing abilities that contradicted ideological requirements of pure-blood supremacy, while their desperate attempts to prove their worthiness of continued existence through genealogical research and character testimony revealed tragic faith in legal systems that had been corrupted beyond recognition by administrators who viewed compassion as weakness and mercy as betrayal, revolutionary principles. Her questioning of these individuals revealed both bureaucratic thoroughness and personal sadism that found expression through legal authority that made resistance impossible and appeals futile, as she systematically dismantled lives while maintaining facade of official neutrality that concealed ideological motivations and personal prejudices that drove her enthusiasm for duties that others found psychologically difficult or ethically problematic to perform with necessary efficiency and apparent satisfaction. The sentences she imposed reflected both commission guidelines and personal judgment about appropriate punishment for individuals whose existence challenged her worldview and whose elimination would advance both institutional objectives and personal psychological needs for control over vulnerable populations whose circumstances made them perfect targets for systematic cruelty disguised as administrative necessity and governmental policy implementation that served larger political purposes. But even as her position provided unprecedented opportunities for exercising authority and implementing policies that reflected her deepest beliefs about magical society's proper organization, external events were developing that would ultimately challenge every assumption about regime permanence and institutional stability that had sustained her confidence throughout months of increasingly systematic persecution of targeted populations through legal mechanisms that had seemed invulnerable to opposition or resistance. The infiltration of the ministry by Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ronald Weasley on September 2nd represented direct challenge to security measures that had been designed to prevent exactly such unauthorized access to sensitive areas where commission operations were conducted, while their success in penetrating multiple layers of protection demonstrated both inadequacy of existing safeguards and existence of opposition capabilities that exceeded official assessments of resistance movements' resources and tactical sophistication. Their use of Polyjuice Potion to assume identities of ministry employees revealed security vulnerabilities that had been overlooked by administrators, whose confidence in their surveillance systems had created blind spots that could be exploited by individuals with sufficient knowledge of bureaucratic procedures, and institutional weaknesses that regular employees took for granted, while external enemies studied carefully for potential exploitation during operations that required temporary infiltration rather than permanent penetration. The specific identities they assumed for their infiltration mission reflected careful planning and detailed knowledge of ministry personnel that suggested extensive preparation and possibly internal assistance from sources whose loyalty to the current regime was questionable, despite their apparent compliance with official policies and administrative directives that required enthusiastic cooperation rather than grudging obedience from all governmental employees, regardless of personal feelings about institutional changes. Harry's transformation into Runcorn, a ministry employee whose reputation for aggressive enforcement of new policies provided perfect cover for someone whose actual mission involved gathering intelligence and potentially disrupting Commission operations, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics and individual psychology that made detection virtually impossible for security personnel who expected infiltrators to behave suspiciously rather than enthusiastically, embracing their temporary roles. Hermione's assumption of Mafalda Hopkirk's identity provided access to administrative levels where commission records were maintained and hearings were conducted, while her knowledge of bureaucratic procedures and legal terminology enabled her to navigate complex institutional environment without arousing suspicion from colleagues who expected certain levels of competence and familiarity with regulatory requirements from anyone holding senior administrative positions within governmental hierarchy. The morning's commission session proceeded according to established routines that had become mechanical through repetition, as defendants were processed through predetermined procedures while maintaining appearance of individual consideration and careful evaluation that concealed systematic nature of persecution campaign designed to eliminate entire categories of magical citizens through legal mechanisms rather than obvious violence that might generate sympathy or resistance from observers who retained capacity for moral judgment. Her conduct of the hearing demonstrated characteristic combination of bureaucratic efficiency and personal cruelty that had marked her entire career, as she systematically destroyed lives while maintaining facade of official neutrality that provided psychological distance from consequences of her decisions while satisfying personal needs for power and control that had driven her advancement through institutional hierarchies that rewarded such characteristics when properly channeled through legitimate governmental functions. The defendants' desperate attempts to prove their magical heritage and worthiness of continued existence revealed both their faith in legal processes and their ignorance of political realities that made their fates predetermined, regardless of evidence or testimony they might provide in support of their cases. While their obvious terror and confusion demonstrated human costs of policies that reduced complex individuals to administrative categories requiring efficient processing rather than individual consideration. But the routine nature of these proceedings was disrupted by Harry's intervention in defense of individuals whose persecution he could not tolerate, despite operational requirements that demanded maintaining cover until their primary mission objectives could be achieved through methods that avoided unnecessary confrontation with security forces, whose response might compromise their ability to complete assignments that were essential for broader resistance efforts against tyrannical regime. His use of a stunning spell to incapacitate Dolores during the hearing represented abandonment of stealth in favor of direct action that reflected moral imperatives that transcended tactical considerations, while his decision to prioritize immediate protection of vulnerable individuals over long-term strategic objectives demonstrated character traits that had made him effective leader of resistance movement. Despite his youth, and limited, experience with complex operations requiring careful coordination and precise timing. The theft of Salazar Slytherin's locket from her unconscious form occurred so quickly that security personnel could not respond effectively, while Hermione's substitution of identical replica ensured that the robbery would not be discovered immediately, providing valuable time for their escape before alarm could be raised and pursuit organized through institutional resources that included both human agents and magical detection systems that could track individuals through various concealment methods. The recovery of the Horcrux represented major victory for resistance forces whose understanding of Voldemort's vulnerability to destruction of these artifacts made acquisition of each soul fragment essential for ultimate victory over Dark Lord, whose apparent invincibility depended on magical protections that could be systematically dismantled through careful research, and dangerous missions that required tremendous personal sacrifice from individuals willing to risk everything for larger cause. But perhaps more significantly, the successful infiltration of Ministry headquarters demonstrated that even systematic security measures and comprehensive surveillance systems could not prevent determined opposition from achieving objectives that required temporary access to sensitive areas where critical operations were, conducted by administrators who had grown complacent through months of unchallenged authority and institutional control that seemed absolute and permanent. Her unconscious state during the theft meant that she retained no memory of specific events that had led to loss of the locket, though her awareness that something significant had occurred during what should have been routine hearing created paranoid suspicions about security breaches and potential sabotage that would influence her behavior and decision-making. Processes for remaining duration of her service to regime that was already beginning to show signs of vulnerability and institutional decay. The discovery that her locket had been replaced with replica required careful investigation that could not be conducted openly without revealing extent of security failure that had allowed unauthorized personnel to penetrate commission headquarters and operate within sensitive areas where classified activities were conducted under highest levels of protection that was supposed to prevent exactly such breaches of institutional security and operational integrity. Her response to this violation involved increased surveillance of subordinates and enhanced security procedures that created atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia among Ministry employees whose loyalty was already being tested through various means designed to identify potential collaborators with resistance forces whose capabilities had clearly been underestimated by security assessments that had failed to anticipate sophisticated infiltration techniques and coordinated opposition activities. But even as she implemented countermeasures designed to prevent future security breaches, the psychological impact of discovering that her personal possessions could be stolen from her very presence created deeper insecurities about her safety and authority that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior and harsh treatment of subordinates whose competence she began to question in light of failures that threatened both her position and her physical security within institutional environment she had considered completely secure. The remaining months of Voldemort's control over magical government were marked by escalating paranoia and increasingly desperate measures to maintain control over populations whose resistance was growing despite systematic persecution and enhanced security measures that seemed to create additional sources of opposition rather than eliminating existing threats to regime stability and ideological objectives that required popular support, or at least passive acquiescence from magical citizens. Her continued prosecution of Muggle-born wizards proceeded with enhanced intensity that reflected both official pressure to accelerate elimination processes and personal psychological needs to demonstrate authority and competence in face of security, failures that had undermined confidence in her administrative capabilities and institutional effectiveness that had been foundation of her career, advancement and professional identity throughout decades of bureaucratic service. The trials she conducted during this period revealed increasing signs of psychological instability and sadistic pleasure in inflicting suffering that transcended official requirements and reflected personal pathology that had been unleashed through institutional authority that provided legal frameworks for expressing cruel impulses without external constraints or moral oversight, that might have limited scope of persecution activities and individual suffering inflicted through bureaucratic mechanisms. But external military situation was deteriorating rapidly as resistance forces gained strength and popular support, while regime's authoritarian policies created additional sources of opposition among previously neutral populations, whose experiences with systematic persecution convinced them that accommodation with tyrannical government was impossible, and resistance was necessary for basic survival and preservation of fundamental values that defined magical society's character and identity. The Battle of Hogwarts represented final confrontation between forces of freedom and tyranny, where outcome would determine whether magical Britain would return to democratic governance or remain under control of authoritarian regime that had systematically destroyed institutions and relationships that had maintained social cohesion and individual liberty for centuries of relatively peaceful development and gradual progress toward more inclusive and just society. Voldemort's defeat during that climactic battle created power vacuum that allowed surviving democratic institutions to reassert authority while beginning process of reconstruction and reconciliation that would address both immediate, practical needs and longer-term questions about accountability for crimes committed by individuals who had served tyrannical regime through various levels of collaboration and active participation in systematic persecution of innocent people. The restoration of legitimate government under Minister Kingsley Shacklebolt represented return to constitutional principles and legal procedures that had been suspended or corrupted during period of authoritarian control, while new administration faced enormous challenges of rebuilding institutional trust and social cohesion that had been systematically destroyed through policies designed to divide magical society along lines that served political objectives rather than community welfare and individual flourishing. Her arrest for war crimes committed during her service to Voldemort's regime represented both practical necessity for establishing accountability and symbolic importance of demonstrating that collaboration with tyrannical government would have lasting consequences, regardless of bureaucratic positions or administrative competence that had made such collaboration valuable to those who had exploited existing governmental structures for purposes that violated every principle of justice and human dignity. The charges against her included systematic persecution of Muggle-born wizards, torture of students through illegal disciplinary methods, corruption of judicial processes for political purposes, and collaboration with enemy forces during their occupation of magical government institutions that had been entrusted to her care as senior administrator, whose oath of office had required protection of constitutional principles and individual rights that she had systematically violated through policies and actions that served personal and ideological objectives. The trial that determined her fate provided opportunity for public examination of crimes that had been committed through bureaucratic processes, while testimony from survivors of her persecution demonstrated human costs of policies that had reduced complex individuals to administrative categories requiring efficient processing through legal mechanisms that maintained appearance of due process, while serving purposes that had nothing to do with justice or individual rights. Her conviction for torture, imprisonment, and causing deaths of innocent Muggle-born wizards represented judicial recognition of personal responsibility for systematic persecution that could not be dismissed as following orders or implementing policies that had been developed by higher authorities, while evidence presented during proceedings revealed extent to which personal prejudices and sadistic impulses had influenced her administrative decisions throughout her career. The sentence of life imprisonment in Azkaban reflected both severity of her crimes and broader social consensus that certain forms of collaboration with tyrannical government required permanent removal from society, where such individuals might again achieve positions of authority that could be used to implement discriminatory policies or persecute vulnerable populations through institutional mechanisms that provided legal cover for systematic cruelty and ideological extremism. Her final years in Azkaban prison represented complete reversal of power relationships that had defined her entire adult life. As someone who had systematically controlled every aspect of other people's existence, found herself subject to institutional authority that provided no opportunities for manipulation or advancement through bureaucratic maneuvering and strategic relationship building that had characterized her previous career advancement through governmental hierarchies. The psychological impact of powerlessness and isolation was particularly severe for someone whose identity had been built around authority over others, and whose satisfaction had come from controlling vulnerable populations rather than achieving genuine accomplishments or developing authentic relationships that might have provided emotional support during period of imprisonment and social rejection that marked her final punishment for lifetime of choices that had prioritized personal advancement over human dignity and institutional service over justice. The legacy of her crimes would persist in memories of survivors whose lives had been permanently altered by her persecution, while institutional reforms implemented after her conviction were designed to prevent similar abuse of authority through enhanced oversight mechanisms and legal protections that might prevent future administrators from using bureaucratic positions to implement systematic discrimination or personal vendettas disguised as legitimate governmental policy. But perhaps her most lasting impact was demonstration of how ordinary evil could flourish within institutional structures that provided authority without accountability, showing how bureaucratic competence divorced from moral constraints could serve any political system equally well, while inflicting tremendous suffering on innocent people whose only protection lay in vigilance of democratic institutions and individual courage to resist illegitimate authority, regardless of personal consequences or professional risks that such resistance might entail for those who chose principle over convenience. And so ends the twisted tale of Dolores Jane Umbridge, the witch who proved that true evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious malevolence, but instead creeps into positions of authority wearing pink cardigans and speaking in honeyed tones that mask hearts blackened by prejudice and souls corrupted by the intoxicating poison of unchecked power. Her story serves as eternal warning about the dangers that lurk not in dark alleys or forbidden forests, but in government offices and institutional corridors, where bureaucratic authority can be wielded like a wand against those too vulnerable to defend themselves from systematic cruelty disguised as policy implementation. Rest now, weary traveler, knowing that monsters like Umbridge ultimately face justice when brave souls refuse to accept that cruelty is acceptable simply because it wears official badges and speaks in regulatory language. Sleep peacefully in the understanding that her pink-decorated reign of terror could only persist while good people remained silent, but crumbled the moment courage found its voice, and resistance took action against institutionalized oppression that had forgotten its purpose was service rather than dominance. Close your eyes and let her defeat remind you that even the most carefully constructed facades of respectability cannot indefinitely conceal the rot beneath, and that accountability, though sometimes delayed, remains the final destination for those who choose power over principle. Sweet dreams, dear listener. In a world where justice may be slow, but is never truly absent from those who seek it, with persistent dedication and unwavering moral courage.